the first time we're gonna do a Supercrit in the midterm. It's a kind of experiment, I think also a response of what the semester have been until now, this kind of global experiment of how we manage to transfer architectural education and specifically studio to an online world in less than a week. An experiment that has been, I think, to this point, extremely successful. If success is something that can be applied to these things that we're doing, we've been seeing amazing work coming up, good discussions, and Zoom, which initially seemed to be a hindering mechanism to actually be able to produce architecture, has become mastered by many, and a help to actually focus discussions and things like that. We're gonna use it now for this kind of massive event, Supercrit of tons of people. We decided to sorry, we decided to ask each of the studio leaders, 12 studio leaders, to select one project, not necessarily the best or the worst, but basically something that will allow us to get a glimpse of what's going on in the studios, but also get a glimpse of what should be discussed or what they think should be discussed in this session. And to enable that conversation, we have invited a kind of an amazing panel of viewers. Some of them are here, some of them will join. I think you probably know all of them, and if you don't, you should, because we are delighted to be joined today by Ana Pujanev from Mayo, also the coordinator of first year in the Graduate School of Planning and Preservation at Columbia University, kind of a close friend and a kind of a person we have discussed endlessly topics around architecture and other things, and not architecture related, who is right now trapped in Barcelona with me, but not with me in the apartment, but somewhere far away. So we just get to share beers sometimes when we're bored. Matilde Casani, and I'm just going in order through the screens that I have in front of in front of me. Is another kind of close friend that I met. I had known for years, since her work in New York, the storefront, the amazing work that she did, kind of discovering how informal spaces were using for religious purposes, and put together an amazing exhibition together. But then we have been meet each other lately, and I have a lot to, because I have this kind of project in Milan. I have not only like to meet her here a couple of times, but actually she's been nice enough to lend me her apartment once. So an amazing apartment, if you have a chance. Her work, I think, is known enough. I mean, her own practice in different biennales, amazing work, for example, for the last Manifesta, but also I think the kind of the design of Broken Nature in the last Triennale, Milan Triennale, was kind of astonishing. Sumaya Bali is kind of also the third kind of panelist that we have today, and is here already. Sumaya runs the practice ContraSpace from Johannesburg, is a key kind of figure in the Graduate School of Architecture in Johannesburg, Unit 12, one of the kind of leading institutions defining architectural education in the African continent. And but also kind of the author of the project that will be, she just kind of confirmed a few minutes ago, will be built next year because of coronavirus in Hyde Park, right? The pavilion that each year is built there, this time has been kind of moved from kind of famous and well-established architects to a practice that as ContraSpace, a practice that not only is young practice and experimental practice, but a practice that is kind of off-center from the traditional origins of the architects that get to build that pavilion, the Serpentine Pavilion in Hyde Park. I think this panel kind of give us a kind of a range of approaches and kind of ways of thinking about architecture that would be almost perfect to address also the range of proposals that we're going to see today. Tom Weaver, the kind of the editor, the former editor of the AA Files, and now working at MIT Press, will join because he's actually teaching remotely an elective and just finished today. Daniel Barber also will join eventually, and I think other friends and folks, and I think some of the studio leaders have invited other people. So I think it's going to be a crowd session, and it's going to be a kind of a tight session. You please, especially for the invitees, remember that it's right now 6 p.m. or 6:15 p.m., 6:10 p.m. in Sydney. So we probably will be finishing around 9 p.m. and some of our studio leaders and students will be exhausted as after a long day that included also a studio teaching. I think that is my introduction. Miguel, you were raising the hand. You want to say something?
No, I'm saying that I'm one of those.
You've been teaching all day. Okay. So again, thank you everyone for the amazing effort. I'm gonna open up directly to Anna. 6 people are waiting. Anna, you're twice. You're in the waiting room twice. Are you trying to get in several times?
What? What happened with Anna?
Nothing. That's okay. So maybe you have. Yeah,
Can you accept me again?
Yeah, I just did.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think you all both you all have the kind of the schedule as usual. We're gonna start 15 minutes late, and then we'll try to go get kind of get back the time. I don't know exactly where, but we will try hard. We're going to start with 2 studios, and that's going to be the model. Each studio will present for 5 minutes, or each student or each project will be present for 5 minutes. And then after 2 presentations, we will open up for general comments. It's going to be a little bit hectic because the kind of the studios, as I say, are quite different. But all the jurors have kind of a description of different studios, so they have been briefed in advance of what is the topic that the studio is discussing, right? So Rowan and Jerome, you're going to be the first ones, so you have the responsibility of kind of addressing the fact that maybe it's going to be a kind of a little bit kind of you're opening this thing. But be aware that everybody knows or should know about what the studio are about. Jerome and Roy, we're going to talk about Planet City Studio, the one that is being taught right now by Maya Sanchez and in collaboration with Liam Yang. So please be my guest. Go for it. Cool. Oh, Francesca is here. Hi, Francesca.
Yeah, I'm here.
Already.
Hi.
And is Tom around? Is Tom already, or is taking a break?
Tom's just wrapping up, saying thank you to the students joining. We just wrapped up his elective, so he'll be here in 2 seconds.
Good.
Great to see everyone.
Rowan, Jerome, please go, and I will take in time. Don't spend more than 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi.
Okay. Great.
Okay.
I'm just going to share my screen with everyone.
Yeah.
Cool. Can everyone see 3 sets of drawings? Yeah?
Okay.
We can see it, Rowan.
Cool. All right.
I can, although when you put your text up, I can see it. So maybe, yeah. Cool.
All my notes are still secret?
Yeah. I'll do the same. So we're improvising.
Yeah, all off the cuff, don't worry. All right, let's begin. So the task of the Planetary City Studio has been an exploration into the new forms of inhabitation set against the hyperdense background of Planet City, a near-future metropolis host to all of Earth's 8 billion people. The studio takes focus on the topology of the Soviet social condenser, wherein performance was key in the development and propagation of alternative social values. The social condenser was, an education scheme which used the methods of cinema to extend the scope of audience and situate ideological experiences at the forefront of culture. An extension of the project for total education for the new socialist citizen beyond the classroom or the workplace.
Social condensers provided the toolkit for us to understand how ideology manifests within rapidly changing environments. In order to deal with the cosmopolitics of Planet City, our project has been conceived through the lens of a contemporary manifesto. Calling for the radical planetary existence made by Bruno Latour in Down to Earth, he gives a sort of recount or a preamble to Planet City, a society unable and unwilling to respond to the oncoming climatic crisis. In our narrative of the space, which has been essential to our studio, society did not avoid that breaking point. However, it was given a second chance. Planet City was founded on an encounter with the new climatic regime. Our reading of the Likachev Palace of Culture is perhaps the downfall of the Soviet condenser, that it existed as a funnel from other spaces in the city into a site rather than an infection of the urban fabric around it. Our project aims to support the ways of living necessary under a new climatic regime rather than the extractive practices of globalization or denialist practices of localization.
This process of recalibration is underpinned by challenging the systems which perpetuate Western empirical knowledge and thereby keep it under lock and key. The project profanates the typologies observatory, theatre, and library, 3 pillars of the Enlightenment. Rather than operating as fortresses for the superiority of empirical Western traditions, these institutions aim to open the gates to diverse and confronting traditions of thought and knowledge. Libraries that embrace collections beyond the text and digital, through to the performative or maintained by non-human agents. Observatories which place under examination not only the astronomical significance of the stars, but also the phenomenological. Observatories that re-aim the telescope back to Earth. The theatre is manifest in many levels. There is the inversion of the traditional theatre, black box, disintegrating the distinctions between stage, seat, and street. But this disintegration permeates the aims across all stages of our project. Any cultural institution is a stage for the performance of living, the stage upon which societies can choose to self-mythologize or self-reflect. To this end, we read 3 interpretations of the theatre. The theatre of war, where sites of cultural prototyping become the battleground of ideology. Theatres of operations, where dominant narratives can be profanated with misuse and alienation. And theatres of mass action, where procession and circulation become spectacles of collectivity, and finally as theatres of illusion, which blur the boundary between daily life and performance to create sites of curiosity.
The urban condition of our program is the bazaar, which is a centralized arrangement of educational facilities surrounding an estuary, fragmented and dispersed along narrow streets, that is carved into the urban fabric of Planet City. The bazaar facilitates access to plural experiences and potentially conflicting ideas and practices within an agonistic framework. Values of the bazaar work against the values that pre-existed society beforehand, connecting a field of mixing newcomers, orienting themselves towards the city. Though drawn on the plan as a street, the typology of the bazaar inverts the position away from the street, from speed and the external, and instead slows movement, blurring the interior and exterior, reorienting the street from the model of mobility and consumption to staging for political life, intentionally conflictual. The framework of the bazaar becomes a space that concatenates demographic difference in search for democracy in Planet City. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're gonna.
I see you've just muted yourself.
Sorry. So Jacqueline Tram and Julia Ramos, if you can go ahead and kind of share your screen.
Yep.
Thank you. All right, could everyone see the screen?
Yep.
All right, so we'll just begin. Dossier's Cities Under Surveillance explores the systems of control that govern, regulate, and organize urban public space. This semester, we are studying Beirut to expand the discourse on forms of control in a post-traumatic context. Operating within this context, spatial practices have deployed forensic methodologies to construct counter-narratives, fictions and imaginaries that bypass states of amnesia and address absences or forgotten histories. Respectively, the first half of the semester has seen us investigate these methodologies, for which we will then deploy to construct counter-narratives in Beirut. We have been asked to map the workings of the practice, unpack one project to understand the methodology and forms of representation, and then apply these learnings to a chosen crime in Sydney.
Julia and I have been exploring the works of Nolan Oswald Dennis, a multidisciplinary artist primarily operating within a decolonizing discourse. Interested in the hidden structures that organize our subterrane, his works investigate the in-between spaces of politicized ideas, using tools to conceal, reveal, and stitch sometimes opposed, sometimes complementary systems or realms. These reconstructed narratives illuminate subtle, often unseen effects of colonization. Referencing Audre Lorde's idea, the master's tool will never dismantle the master's house, his practice opens up the question of when does a tool stop being the master's tool and become your tool? And what kinds of transformation must happen to give these tools the capacity to dismantle houses?
So the tool therefore becomes an apparatus to read and compose, navigate and understand the workings of Nolan. In the same way, Nolan uses his tools as a vehicle to produce counter-narratives and dismantle dominant colonial discourse. We use these tools as a lens to speculate and unpack the workings of his practice. The tools most prevalent in his practice are astrology, scientific notation, decomposition, and the hand. Astrology is both a functional and symbolic system that opens a metaphysical framework where the alternative and imagined realities can be generated and anticipated. It reflects upon the role and recognition of Indigenous sciences within a dominant scientific discourse. These systems of forming and exploring conclusions are embodied through his use of scientific notation.
These alternate ways of reading and understanding time and space are further embodied through excavation, a tool which creates a means for the past to speak and generate tangible memory. Its interpretation and reading reveals a multitude of truths, and these truths are connected through land and narrative. And for Nolan, decomposition becomes a tool to embody the entanglement of past, present, and future, and a tool to compose. And finally, the hand is the initial and final tool in his process. It is a means of control to conceal, reveal, decolor, and reconstruct his narratives. Deconstructing, demonstrating that the act of making things invisible is revelatory in itself.
So this map explores the organized yet entangled nature of his projects and highlights the non-linear conditions in which he operates. An instant in which occurs in his 2018 solo exhibition titled Options, encompassing a range of artifacts, mediums, and works. He challenges the notion of finished work, using its vulnerability to misinterpretation as an opportunity for new knowledge to enter the space. He states, "I think the work is only halfway done until it is read. The question is always who is reading and therefore who is doing the other half of the work." The second document, the user is given autonomy to navigate through the map of Dennis's practice. Starting with the main tool, the themes, theories, projects, and historical events are presented as options to interrogate both Nolan's practice and our methodology of researching his practice.
As the user clicks through, a record of their path is generated on a receipt. The receipt becomes a document where you construct your own narrative of Dennis based on your decision. So at times it may feel that the relation between points are unclear, only later to flow within another narrative. These intentional gaps Dennis creates generate points of inquiry for the audience, and it's an opportunity to expand the narrative by actively taking part within it.
So instead, in the installation Biko and Fanon, he extracted every sentence with the words touch and hold from the books The Wretched Earth and I Like What I Write, both post-colonial writers. With this, he creates an algorithm which selects sentences from a data set and produces new sequences as an ongoing conversation triggered from the ambient noise in the room where the printer is placed. Creating an algorithm based on the connections of our initial map, our receipt generates a dialogue between selected text and reference prompted by your speculative click. The receipt can then be exported to further explore this narrative.
Interested in Dennis's system-specific framework as a way to uncover hidden structures and narratives, we explore the idea of contact tracing, a mapping technique that tracks the movement and interactions of a body or bodies, both human and non-human, through the piecing together of specific data sets. And so pseudo-public conditions reveal opportunities to increase the colonization of bodies, extraction of information, and manipulation of behaviors. The vagueness of its limits and restrictions allows for this occupation of control and surveillance. And the current pandemic renders our society and public spaces into these conditions. The exploitation of the crisis provides a moment for forms of governance to emerge under the premise of security and public health, and ultimately at the cost of personal privacy.
The map aims to trace a constellation of governing and surveying technologies and techniques, investigating the ways in which objects, actors, and entities align, are currently aligning, or have previously aligned to each other. These alignments may begin to reveal the imaginary axis, the lines and systems in which our bodies rotate.
Expanding from this, the studio is now entering Beirut from a distance. The methodologies extracted from our investigations will now be deployed on a site along the Green Line, driving proposals for counter-narratives of the city. These interventions will host a space for fiction and speculation between audience and work, dismantle the systems of control that authorize dominant discourse, and aim to reconstitute a memory that accounts for forgotten histories and stories.
And yeah, and that's all. Thank you. We will also share a link to the website if you would like to explore the website that we made as part of this assignment. Thank you.
Thank yeah, yes, please put it on the chat. Sorry, and please remember, everyone who's not speaking, keep the microphone mute. I will do the same, as I realized I wasn't. But I would like to open up for comments from the panel or the studio leaders, questions or kind of any form of a commentary.
I can just start with a couple of questions to both studios. First, my congratulations in advance, because the work, it's really challenging as a reviewer. So I'm looking forward to see how the conversation evolves. And I don't know, I haven't asked previously, I don't know if there's a rule that does not allow the tutors to speak. Otherwise, it would be also interesting to hear their voices at some point. But my question directly to the students first, in the first group of Rowan and Jerome, hi, back again. Nice to see you again. I would love to hear a little bit more, and excuse me if you have explained it, because I couldn't, I missed due to technical problems a little bit of the beginning, but I would love to hear the new type. I mean, you're embracing a new type, a new form of democracy, reshaping the city. So I would love to hear a little bit more about the type of politics that you're imagining behind your project. And the other group, Julia and Jacqueline, the question is really simple. Who is your audience?
So the conceit of the studio run by Amaya was that we were to try to, like, much as the original Soviet social condensers were tools to teach the Soviets how to be socialist citizens when there was no precedent for this. Amaya suggested that we transfer the politics of the Soviet to a new ideological text. Ours being Bruno Latour's Down to Earth. So rather than, I wouldn't say that at this point, Jerem and I have a cohesive argument for the politics that we are proposing for Planet City. Rather, we have taken Latour's ideas about
Globalization plus.
Globalization plus, so like the benefits of plurality in social discourse to democracy, rather than previous regimes of globalization where it's a kind of like Western-based hegemonic extractive relationship. What happens when all of the voices can contribute? Hence our adoption of the bazaar typology, where we can concatenate these potentially conflictual politics as a more socially integrated democracy on the street.
That is just a question in the question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, can you give a definition of bizarre typology? Just to know what you mean.
Like the bazaar, B-A-Z-A-A-R.
Okay, I understood bizarre. So.
No, okay. The Middle Eastern street market blurring inside out.
Bazaar, yeah, sure.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. And just answering the question of who was the audience of our work. I think in our project, we didn't necessarily want to specify or define an audience, because it was more about giving this autonomy to whoever is reading it, and kind of using the uncertainty and of like how people are going to read it as part of like completing the artwork, as Nolan said. And so, yeah, the audience isn't something that we wanted to control. And so whoever approaches it, it's up to them to kind of interpret the narrative and create their own narrative and speculation towards Nolan and his practice.
I have a question. Why did you choose Beirut and not another city? Is there something that really drove you there for specific reasons?
Beirut was the site chosen by the studio leaders that we had. The studio Dossier Cities Under Surveillance is a long studio that runs for 3 years, and they're interested at looking at the systems of control and that govern our bodies in space. Last year it was focused on Johannesburg, looking at the colonial impacts in a comparative study of Sydney and there, and now it's been chosen in Beirut for its post-traumatic context, and also we're particularly interested in the creation of alternative narrative, or the exploration of alternative narratives within the space, within the, city.
Julia, I just want to kind of let everybody know that Tom Weaver has joined us somewhere in one of the screens after 2 hours of review of his fantastic elective Noah's Ark. So hi, welcome, Thomas.
I guess I'll jump in quickly. Thanks both, those were really, really fabulous and fascinating. My first comment for Rowan and Jerem is, have you looked at the different drawing conventions for all the theatres that you mentioned? So theatre of war, operation, what was it? Mass action and illusion. Because I think if you start thinking through the representation of how each of those work, and then you start bleeding them into each other, your politics will uncover themselves. And I think I found the first question really interesting, because even if you don't have an explicit politics, or you're saying it's following on the politics of the studio, our work kind of exposes our politics in a way. So I think in how you draw, it will start to become clearer and clearer. And does that make sense? I'm just wondering if you look at all those conventions of drawing, and then you start to say, okay, in this drawing, it's going to be like 5% about theatre of war, and 20% about theatre of operation, and 50% about illusion, and then in the other drawing it's completely different. It might be 70% about illusion, 20% about this. So you start to, in varying degrees, start to articulate different things about the context that you're working in. And I'm also really interested in this question of typologies. You mentioned the observatory, the theater, and the library. And in my context, we're constantly asking how typologies kind of cement politics, because all of the typologies we have, I guess, are inherited from our colonial and apartheid system. So I think it's really interesting. You did mention digital, and you mentioned bringing in other narratives and other voices, but how do you really start to kind of break free of what the architecture actually looks like? I'm really interested, besides just housing different functions, how can you use your drawing these conventions that you mentioned, or these different types of theater, how can you use them to start to unravel what the typologies are? And then just a quick comment for Julia and Jackie. Fascinating. I know Nolan is also really loving the work, but I found it really interesting that what you're creating is like an archaeology of evidence of how we read things. And I think you may, or maybe you could be a little bit more intentional about this idea of how we read and how our biases are exposed in how we move through something or navigate something. I know it's not there, but it reminded me a lot of forms of categorization. And I think that's also that's something that is very interesting in Nolan's work, when he puts like really soft sciences next to really hard data and what we see as hard sciences. So, sorry, I'm not making a point yet, but I think understanding how we read things and what biases we have when we categorize things is really interesting. And yeah, so I mean, to give a very obvious example, do we categorize things, say, by color, so all the yellow things, or by size, or is it more political than that? And what you've created is kind of like an open system, and maybe if each thing starts to have tags, and we use tags to navigate them, we'll start to read into our own biases a lot more. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Maya, thank you. They're wonderful points as ever. I've got kind of, in a sense, two very quick points. One for Jerem and Rowan. I guess I'm struggling with the gap between your words and your drawings. And it might be something really quite simple that you need to do to start to address that gap, which is just to draw the section. Because the section of the bazaar is super important. And to really explore the gap between the words and the drawing through the cut of the section. And then for Julia and Jacqueline, when you started this semester, we were yet to, share our existence with this virus and the way this virus has been used to hoover up data, has been used to kind of reorganize all kinds of systems of governance and so on. The tracing, I hope the study of the tracing app doesn't become a kind of footnote in your work as you develop it. If you take it to Beirut, I hope it comes back to Sydney. Because, in a sense for me right now, Sydney is more interesting potentially than Beirut under the Green Line, looking at Beirut under the Green Line mediated through media. I mean, in a sense, the two things are going to be disentangled, and I hope that you're able to kind of continue to explore that entangling, and to really ultimately, I hope it becomes a boomerang project and it comes back to Sydney. Enough.
I only have one thing to say, and that is that it's difficult on a Friday night to talk, but when I think of the social condenser and that kind of thesis of OSA, I think of the whole premise which was incredibly powerful, that space could change people's behavior. And then the question was, what does one do in the designing of space that would cause for people to behave in a certain way? And then the question is, did that fail or succeed? And the question is, what are the lessons that you have learned from that historical evidence? And what are you doing in your designs as a consequence? And all of that is the thesis, I believe, for the studio, particularly in the context of such heavily laden history. And I say that because it's a painful history. And in the context of a studio such as this, which is contextualized by the kind of malaise of this separation, what is it? What is it that you draw? Because if you're not building anything, you're just describing it in a kind of communication. And it's not just the drawing, it's the words. And the words are always, in my opinion, much more powerful than anything you can draw or anything you can build. And I just wonder what you're saying about that. What are you saying about what is possible in the human condition, in your observations, to change in what we do as architects to affect behavior? I didn't hear any of that. I just know that it exists as a kind of important lesson, an important position of OSA in that period of Russia, which, let's face it, it's 3 years of discussion. And it was based on a kind of Milovich, or the sort of the beginnings of abstract expressionism, which was taking away from reality. So it starts from a place where it isn't about reality. It's about taking away from reality. It's about the turning away from things that could be referenced into the world. And then that caused this OSA thesis. And then what did you learn from that you're importing into your bazaar and all the things that you're putting? I'm interested in that as a kind of consequence of your work. And I'm interested in then the talking about it and then the not talking about it. I'm actually more interested in the not talking about it. I'm interested in what did you do and how is it evident in the work that you produced? I'm not talking. That's all.
Any responses?
Well, there's no talking. I don't know. I'm just fascinated by this. I love that period, and I love the terrible thing that happened to the religious aspects of it with the politics. The terrible thing that happened to people in the House of Horrors, and that is completely whitewashed with the ideas. I'm interested in actually that and the bullshit that came with it.
Any takes? I think.
Do we have more time? Okay.
Yes.
This is a beautiful, beautiful topic. I love this topic.
Yeah, I love it too. I wanted to continue a bit what Sumaya was mentioning before. I think that she addressed really nicely an issue in relation with Rowan and Jerome project about the idea of typology, and I think that readdressing the public sphere, in this case through the space in between or the thresholds of those urban spaces. The other day, I was talking with Marina Otero, and actually Matilde was also there, and Marina was recalling the need, the project that Jonas Stahl did for the Oslo Triennial, where he built this dome.
The parliament.
Exactly, as a parliament for those parts of those nations that lack of political voice and lack of a parliament. And Marina was being critical with the form itself, because he was using, you know, the prototypical dome that it has been overused, etc. But precisely, Jonas Stahl answered that it's precisely by the fact that it has been overused and already signified by some politics that should be re-signified. So in terms of not only form, but also architectural typologies, there's a really interesting thing to approach and push further, which would be to re-signify politically certain typologies and certain forms. And by that, for instance, look at the parliaments, right? We do certain parliaments do have certain forms and represent certain politics, but also certain urban spaces. So if you think about that in relation with your project, I think that then the form can be extremely well argued and defined more precisely, as well as the typology, as Sumaya was calling. In terms of, I asked before to the other group, Julia and Jacqueline, about the audience, because I think that there's a huge risk about considering everyone. You know, the idea of everyone is extremely biased, and it can neglect a lot of parts of the society. So I think that when, as architects, when we think about audiences and spaces, obviously, because the audience is always related with the physical space, for instance, the audience of a museum, you know, the audience of the domestic space, etc., etc. Think about how these maps are going to be accessible, or how certain parts of the society are going to be related with these maps. And I'm thinking about, you know, children, elderly, but also people that lack of access to phones that therefore cannot be tracked, and the internet and new technologies. So I think that it's important to think about that large scope in order to redefine clearer your proposal.
I don't want to cut the conversation. I think the conversation is going to be punctuated for a series of presentations, and they will feed into each other. So don't think that we're commenting into specific projects, but actually try to keep going through a conversation with examples. And we're going to move from theater and kind of art practices as a way of operating in the city to maybe another side of the things that are happening in the studio with Neoma and Billy project for Guillermo's studio, the Public Corporate. So if you want to go for it, please share the story.
Thank you very much for the feedback, by the way.
Oh yeah, thank you for everyone.
Thank you so much.
Super helpful. Thank you.
Cool. All right, we're going to start. Hi, everybody. Billy and myself, Nyoa, are presenting on behalf of the Public Corporate Studio by Guillermo Fernandez Abascal. The studio proposes a 1,000-person regional government architect's office for New South Wales, situated in Armidale, a regional centre of 25,000. The specific site is Robb College at the University of New England, designed by a 24-year-old Michael Dysart as a part of the New South Wales Government Architect's Office in 1960 and completed in 1964. The college has recently been denied heritage recognition, and 3 of the 4 buildings have now been demolished. The dining hall is the last remaining. Our scheme, the Public Design Room, is a public corporate office that operates solely in a regional New South Wales context. It is a subsidiary company of the New South Wales State Government, located within the Public Works Advisory, a subsection of the Finance, Service and Innovation Department. It aims to produce a wide and far-reaching body of good sound architecture, enacted through a number of core structural and architectural strategies. As a subsidiary of the state, the office staff wages and operational costs are funded by the New South Wales Government. These are the only expenses from the state. Otherwise, the Public Design Room follows a private developer economic model. This operates where the office purchases land for a public building, where then the costs of which are offset by developing a private rentable project. However, as a social enterprise, the intentions shift from being one of profit maximization to public good. The private development aims to only cover the costs of the public one and nothing more. Any additional revenue is plugged back into the state. This means the cycle of production is heavily managed by the office itself.
The Public Design Room operates through the majority of staff directly working on the production of architecture. 850 staff are dedicated to the drawing room. 150 employees make up the auxiliary programs of the office, including a library, workshop, grounds maintenance, and others. Included in the 850 staff are the multiple in-house disciplines that are required to produce architecture, such as engineers, town planners, and architects. The Public Design Room aims to establish a consistent approach across the scale of office and works at 3 scales: the territory, the building, and the detail. Through a series of territorial interventions, buildings will be developed using a consistent shared body of knowledge in relation to detail and construction. Armidale can therefore be seen as the initial territorial project of the office, and the Public Design Room as the first building to be executed as a part of it. With the intention of, with the introduction, of 1,000 staff and their respective families, Armidale will experience a population increase of roughly 10% and will inevitably alter significantly to accommodate this. Our proposal acknowledges this condition that precedes any architecture and further recognises itself, the architecture, as a well-intentioned but violent act. The scheme wraps around the existing Rob dining hall. It repurposes it as the entrance and corrects the facade by demolishing the back of house, bringing the iconographic courtyard elevation to the street. Entering through the new lobby leads to a courtyard where the topography remains as found. The insertion of a platform follows the slope of the site and transforms the descending land into a flat, heavily planted and curated reserve. Long open drawing rooms flank each side, with meeting rooms and offices on the mezzanine above and auxiliary programs located in the level below. Services and parking sit in the basement. The building contains only a few ideas, but has ambitions to follow them through to the furthest possible degree. Thank you.
Thank you, Billy. We're gonna move now to Jacob's proposal for Angelo Candelapa's studio at Room with the Throne.
Hi everyone, can you all see the screen? All right, tonight I'm representing Angelo Candelapa's studio, A Reading Room with a Throne. However, this presentation is going to be a little bit different to most. I'll be showing a variety of work from a number of students as well as my own in order to encourage discourse and critique of the studio's processes of design as a whole. Whoops, sorry. The studio will consider how to read architectural space, provide guidance into an understanding of proportion and how this affects the human condition, and will balance between that which is drawn and that which is experienced. It will be a studio that will focus on transformative space and the concept of restricting the possible outcomes in terms of external parameters and room forms to enable a focused consideration of the variabilities and expression available in architectural space. This is the site, the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese, I always have trouble with that, of Australia's Cathedral of the Annunciation of Our Lady, home to the Archbishop of the Greek Orthodox Church. The brief is the studio's title, A Reading Room and a Throne Room, and is a brief that Candelapas Associates is currently developing in their practice. The site is historic, a combination of Anglican and Western buildings, with the church itself being designed by Edmund Blackett, who designed St. Andrew's Cathedral. The set precedent for both the office and the studio is consistent, the San Lorenzo Library and its entry room in Florence, designed by Michelangelo. The studio will delve into historical considerations of early Christian architecture and will visit various historic cities, including Constantinople, Florence, and Rome, in order to draw a lineage between early and Renaissance ideas about public rooms. All of us took on the Sydney Opera House as a precedent exercise, with the task asking each student to analyze the spatial experiences they perceived, whether it be through section, by photograph, or if they were lucky before social distancing, by personal experience, and model them in abstract form. What arose from this was a discovery of a very specific set of design spaces and thresholds, a compression of space to an expansion of space, a heaviness of atmosphere to an almost weightlessness quality. These journeys between spaces through these thresholds were then attempted in model form. Each of us moved on to our own precedent studies next. These precedents included Dioxiades' reading of the Acropolis in Athens, the Theatre of Herodotus Atticus, also in Athens, the St. Benedictusburg Abbey in the Netherlands, designed by Dom Hans van der Laan, Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, and the Brion Cemetery in Italy, designed by Carlo Scappa, and laid the foundations of understanding of proportions, sightlines, geometries, and orientations within the design of spaces. Further detail can also be taken from precedents, the way a column or wall is designed, the way one material intersects another, the way specific stair is aligned, the impressions are endless. A combination of these values taken from the various precedents, as well as an understanding of these foundations, meant it was time to begin designing. For our studio, however, this didn't mean drawing. This meant writing, documenting our ideas of the spatial experience each of us envisioned for our design. Are you kidding, Angelo? We've just spent weeks with precedents ready to tear into designing, and now you want us to write? But it was a little bit more than that. How can you use words to describe the space you want people to experience? How do you want your space to feel, and how can you achieve that? Are you successful? How vivid can you be with your descriptions? Words leave themselves open to interpretation, and so the space envisioned by two people after reading the same passage is always different. A combination of all these elements takes us to the beginnings of a design, an idea, a concept, whatever it might be. The combination of these elements, however, and the way in which they become encapsulated into a design provokes some really interesting questions. How does the site inspire design? What begins to take priority when planning or designing a space like this? Is it the books, the throne, or the purpose of the room? Or is it the experience and the actual spatial considerations that come with it? Is it best to look towards historical precedents or towards newer design methodologies? All of this relates back to the notion of hierarchy and priority while designing a space. Our tutorial this morning went a step further and was focused on a new process integral to designing an interior, sectional models and their play on light and shadows. This isn't just how light falls or is brought into a space. This is about what type of light is drawn in, what it might fall on in terms of materiality, the orientation of the surface the light falls on. For example, light hitting a curved surface compared to a flat surface is very different. This technique also plays back into how you want your space to be experienced and all the work beginning the design. The ideas have been established. Now we must bridge what has been drawn and made and explained to what will be experienced. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacob. So we will open again to either continue the conversations before or have some thought about what we're seeing before and now.
I just want to briefly say that there's something really extraordinary going on with Angelo's studio, in that you are doing a studio that is absolutely haptic, absolutely somatic, absolutely about being in a body at a time when we have never been more out of our bodies. And that, I think that is something that it would be a great pity if you did not really address. Because in a sense, it's potentially really radical. What does it mean to do a studio that in many ways is traditional, in that it's dealing with experience and it's dealing with existing in a body that is then in the body of the building, at a time when not only can we not be in the body in the building, but we actually can't even be in our bodies, and we can't be in our bodies together.
Well, I found it interesting that we've learned more I've learned more in this studio about that specific issue by its absence. And what's very fascinating for me is that one has memories of things that one cannot imagine without applying oneself to these tasks and these exercises. And it's a bit like a memory that you invent when you look at look at a plan that isn't able to give you anything other than lines on a page. And we find ourselves creating the space in our minds in a very peculiar way. And I find that is the sort of place that I was in when I was a student at UTS, and I couldn't afford to go to Italy or anywhere. And I'd invented the spaces in my mind by reading plans and texts. And at the time, there was this wonderful Umberto Eco book about the name of the rose, and it had this kind of scene in a place which, and this is why Miguel's work is so fascinating to me, is seen in a place which isn't really fantasy. The reciprocation of what is fantasy and what is real is really interesting in my studio at this time, because it's almost as though it's more powerful to not have space to look at as precedent, because we have to then invent things from ourselves, from nothing. And the haptic sense comes from the memory of people. I don't know what the answer to it is, but I know one thing, and that is that I would love to do it again when I can go overseas. And in fact, half of it would be in this mode because I really enjoy the absence that comes with no presence of space. And I really enjoy then, I would love to feel the space again with that absence. It's a bit like the hollowness of kind of.
But I think Francesca comment also points out at a kind of an issue that we have in this semester, and I think it's happening all across the world, is the kind of the urgent matter of the conditions that we're dealing with should be addressed or not in the studio briefs. And I would like to open up this question also to the jurors, right? Like, should we discussing is that urgency, should that urgency be kind of shaping the studios, or should we actually be trusting the slowness of architecture as a kind of a way to save ourselves of a kind of a speed, kind of an urgency that maybe is not helping us to reflect. And I of course it's not a kind of clear-cut dichotomy, but I think is something that, especially because of the studio we're running when we moved to digital, to online, was a question that has been there, like either as an elephant in the room or addressed directly by the studios. I don't know what your thoughts on that are.
Who said architecture is slow?
Yes, I think architecture is slow. I mean, for example, it comes actually from when we were preparing the briefs for the studios and having conversations. The crisis we were dealing with was basically the east coast of Australia was on flames, was on fire, and a lot of questions were, oh, we should get more studios that are dealing with this fuck because it's so urgent. And then by the time we start the semester, nobody remembers that the thing was happening. There's one studio that's actually dealing with it, fire, but there's another crisis on it. So I'm not even talking about literally building architecture, which takes a long time, but literally teaching architecture is slow. It requires time. And the relationship with the urgent crisis is always an open question, right? Some of the studios understand that the battleground is a classroom, and therefore the teaching is literally producing kind of consciousness around issues. Others are more focused on other ways of consciousness to design decisions. Basically everyone, Tom doesn't, I don't think is teaching right now, but has taught, but you all have been teaching. So I wanted to know your thoughts about how to deal with the urgency in the context of education.
First, I will, obviously this situation, it's way different than the way that we were living 4 months ago, and probably nobody would expect this. But I loved the article that Paul B. Preciado published 2-3 weeks ago. I mean, as all of us, I'm reading a lot, trying to understand And in that article that he reclaimed that it was through the way a system of governance was treating the pandemic, it was easy to unveil the type of society that you were living in. Mm-hmm. But by that, he was also claiming that all these things are being empowered and turned much more visible were already there before. So it's not that we have a before and after. So civil control, for instance, was already there. The crisis of late capitalism was already there. The crisis of nations and the global market was already there. So said that architecture is really slow, and I do totally agree, but also social changes are also really slow. So I think that it's not one or the other. I think that dichotomies, for instance, are gone forever. So that mentality of trying to categorize society in dichotomies is also gone. So I think that, for instance, in terms of materiality, space, light, etc., things that have been rooted in the discipline for a long time, they have to be signified by the fact that we do know, for instance, that our climate change and our social systems of governance are precisely deeply linked with how things are built, the forms of our cities, etc., etc.
Yeah, I completely agree with you that architecture is very slow, and by the time it incorporates the urgency, it's too late. And it's always the case both in construction, but also in conceiving ideas, because by the time you design everything or you take into account everything, things have changed. So in general, I always considered architecture as an impossible tool to actually keep up with the social content of the cities. For this reason, I would have a question for the group that worked on the public design group room. And the question is twofold. And on one side, I was wondering if you feel like to be part of this design group, and if so, which is your role, let's say. So you're also architects, and I wonder if you imagine yourself to be in this room. And second, in terms of design, in terms of plan, how do you imagine this space to be lived and organized and dealt with by the architects they are living the space?
Could maybe, do you want to go to the plan again? Yes. We can talk over it. I think in regards to the first question, one of the things we've been talking about is in the sort of golden era of government architects, in the 60s and 70s, they were taking a lot of students, and it was a really prestigious place to work, and some of the best architects in the world were in government. And I think for both of us, there's a lot of nostalgia about this thing that we are only really learning about now. And if this were to be a real office, it would be the sort of place we would want to do a sort of cadetship almost. And
there's a proposal in another student's proposal is to make it like a military coursework for students coming out of university. And I think there's lots of value in that, because like Billy's saying, in this golden age, it's a breeding ground. You kind of get the best of everything. You have access to real tangible construction and design, and which is sometimes hard to find. And in this golden age, I think they were saying that there was like 1,500 students applying at one stage to work for the government architect.
12 positions or something.
Yeah.
And so would you be able to repeat your second question again?
My second question is, if I look at the plan, like the drawing of the plan, I see a series of tables grouped in small groups and nothing more, but maybe maybe you can explain me how you imagine the work to be organized, or the architects, how the architects will work together.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of like, will they have meetings? Will they share their work? How will they actually collaborate?
So the idea is that there is like a office structure that we've laid out, and there's a drawing, but that there's a hierarchy, and there's government architects and heads of department, which range from different disciplines, and then, but working on specific jobs, there would be a group of, depending on the size of the job, there'd be a group of architects and engineers, and then it would kind of go through the phases. But above, on the first floor, is a bay. One of the grids is a bay of offices and meeting rooms, and that's kind of, the idea was to keep the ground floor totally public, but then on the first floor, on the mezzanine, and to get everybody to make that kind of ground floor a very dynamic space, so that people are walking past each other and seeing what everyone's up to if you're going to go upstairs.
Where would you sit, Noah? Where would you sit in the plan if you are working there?
Sorry?
What would be your favorite desk?
That's a good question.
Sorry.
In the top left corner.
I
think specifically for the plan, it's like a very deliberate decision to have such long lines of desks and only 2 circulation cores, and it's about this idea of building a cohesive knowledge of architecture, and this idea of, you know, walking past someone's desk or walking across the room to talk to them, and it's sort of quite deliberately an inefficient plan, I guess.
I'd want to sit in the top corner because I can get a view of the lake.
I was waiting for the corner office. I mean, what if the government architects were working from home? And how does that, because so much of what is embedded in here and what you're doing, which I think is super interesting and super important, is a kind of strange nostalgia for the atelier that is an atelier that's almost 100 years old now. And I'm wondering what that means.
But the atelier is better than the contemporary corporate office of Australia. There is no doubt on
that. I think there's a level, like, even though it's a very inefficient plan, there's a level of efficiency in being able to talk directly with somebody and not respond via PDF markup. You know, you can just get it there and then and work through problems.
Sure, but I think in a sense to suggest a connection between the 2 studios, which actually for me is quite powerful, is, you know, what about the absence of the office, the absence of the atelier, the absence of being able to have this direct communication, and Angelo talking about the power of these absent buildings are all the more evocative to us, not being able to get to them, not being able to get in our bodies and get to them. So, I mean, in a sense, back to the slowness of architecture, I'm thinking about the hare and the tortoise, you know, the slow one wins, yeah? But architecture's always been very good at being very slow, but always talking about the present at the same time. For me, it's not an either or decision. We have to be doing both and.
I would say the creating of architecture is slow, but I would say the experiencing of architecture is very fast and immediate and visceral. And so from my point of view, the lack of that experience and that absence is equally visceral and powerful. It's like a kind of absent thing that one yearns for. And speed can only ever be after the post-Einsteinian world. It can only ever be a relative thing. So the question of what is the speed of the thing next to you is also, I think, needing to be answered. And it can be the case that architecture this day can be considered away from its antiquated idea into something very fast, because it doesn't actually need to exist for one to experience it, is what I'm starting to understand.
I'm going to cut you there to get the next step.
Thomas, I love to hear Thomas.
I just only wanted to very quickly just say that that regardless of whether you perceive it as fast or slow or absent or present, I was just struck particularly with that last project by Jacob, how kind of emboldened it was. You take the single greatest one-room interior in the history of architecture, and without any sense of kind of intimidation in dealing with that level of a canon and that level of hierarchy, you kind of engage with it, you whap it right up against this existing building, and you talk through it as a space. So I'm enthused by that level of kind of a lack of intimidation, and the way that history then, and maybe it is something that's simply been prompted by this removal from real life, that you're just there's a lack of fear there, I think. You know, anything that deals with the Laurentian Library next to a railway track in Sydney seems to be admirable, I think. But I think the danger, not so much here though, in some of the other projects, is that when you're dealing with all of these precedents and types and typologies and exemplars, is to conceive your own assignation not curatorially. I think there's maybe a slight preponderance of curation here. That is, we're arranging objects rather than an architectural brief of actually really being more declarative in terms of the control and the authority you have as a designer to actually make that decision, rather than simply just standing behind a kind of an arrangement of exemplars. So instead, just to privilege the actual volume, the space, the edifice that you're creating as an architect.
You are mute, Ursi.
Okay, yeah, I'm going to close this section and move to the next one in order to get to kind of a timely ending eventually. The question of fast was not necessarily about the speed, but actually the continuous questioning, or like the continuous request from the outside of what are you going to be answering this crisis, how you're going to be answering this crisis, or do you have to respond to this crisis? And the fact that I think Cheese Stew Studios clearly decide not to do it in a really explicit way, right? Like the biggest office in the world, and a kind of a room for archivists of archivists of library don't seem to be a kind of the natural responses to deal with these things, even though obviously, as it's kind of clear, and someone point out, this kind of extremely important answers to be found there. We're going to move to the next section that probably is more connected to who are we designing for, starting with Georgia and Patrick project for the Antarctica studio by Luisa and Tamsin. And by the way, there is kind of an amazing parallel discussion going on in the chat. So I will ask the tutors to acknowledge the kind of ventriculous nature of this event, and kind of the projects that are being presented both represent the students and the tutors. So please don't hesitate to kind of add to the conversation, because I think there's this really nice, if you check the chat, you can see what's going on. Georgia or Patrick, you ready?
Yeah, I think Pat's gonna screen share.
Yes.
Cool.
Here we go. All right. How do we practice radical care at a territorial scale? How do we make the old tools of cartography new again? And what operations will these tools need to take on? And how can design encourage multi-species flourishing in the face of climatic collapse?
Through critical imaginations of the Antarctic and territorial interventions of care, the studio aims to deliver a new hybrid ecology. What are the various worlding potentials within the radical changes facing the Southern Oceans? These questions frame the interrogations of the Antarctica 3 studio.
The McMurdo Dry Valleys of Antarctica are home to a particular family of microbes that thrive in the most uninhabitable place on Earth. Sandwiched between particles of sandstone or in microscopic cracks in granite, leaching food from the walls of their home and water from whatever is blown their way.
Exploring the story of the endolith describes the intricacy of Earth's material flows. Abiotic material creeps, explodes, crystallizes, and intrudes into the biotic sphere, where it spits, leaches, burrows, and breeds. Geologic processes become ecologies, neighborhoods, and multi-species networks. The endolithic microbes of the McMurdo Dry Valleys destabilize the very human exceptionalist worldview we have all come to know. We do not even cross their path. Their slow dominance goes unnoticed.
The geological density and its makeup interrelate to define the type of endolithic community that resides. Cryptoendolithic communities live in between the particular particles of softer, more granular rock types. Chasmoendolithic varieties colonize the fissures and cracks in harder, more rigid geologic types and are more compact in their arrangement. Cyanobacteria often resides in the furthermost level from the sun, indicating that endolithic communities may be able to survive on just the rock alone.
The formation of the Antarctic continent began around 180 million years ago with the breakup of the Gondwana supercontinent. The material geology has shifted through various climatic conditions and latitudes, hosting the flourishing and collapse of various life forms. The uniquely hostile environment of the dry valleys is largely caused by katabatic winds that sublimate most precipitation and create a large ice-free area.
In beginning to tell the story of endolithic beings, it was first important to understand in more detail the current geology of the site and the timeframes in which it came to be. This is essential to explain the notion of niche and site specificity, as in essence, the endolithic communities pop up in place, with their high genetic diversity attributed to the rocks in which they live.
But this thin veneer of habitability is not to be mistaken for vulnerability, but extreme endurance. These communities colonize the interface of biology and geology, a mediator of the living and non-living. Endolithic beings are some of, if not the oldest beings on Earth, surviving the perpetual flux of geological processes that has seen other beings perish over and over again. The rapid changes in Antarctica brought on by human unrestraint are a mere blip in the radar, a chance to sharpen the toolbox in the face of unstable environments, ensuring survival through this epoch and well beyond.
A hatched overlay describes the formative geological movements of the valleys. These processes inform the geology's structural composition and how they came to be. This is a map exploring the rocks and at their present and ever-changing state, and using this as an expression of the constant flux of the Earth. The rocks are alive in constant metamorphosis, as are the endoliths living within them, and it is this slow and constant transference of material that highlights the enduring qualities of the Earth and the ephemeral nature of our own existence.
Proposal for a new Antarctic treaty. The warming of Antarctica will uncover more geologic terrain. Endolithic microbes return en masse to full reproductive capacity. The primary producers of this environment endure. The Valley of the Dead no more.
Care cannot be fueled by fear of human mortality. Care should come from an understanding of the continuation of the Earth beyond us. This forges a new way of thinking about deep time and our place within it. Can we ever scratch the surface? Thank you.
Thanks. Oh, you're muted, Tsi.
Sorry, the thing of pressing the space bar is not working anymore. We're going to continue with Edna Umi from Jose Maria Torres Nadal and David Studio, the third institution.
Yep. So, kind of.
Estoy aquí ya puedo buscar. Porque yo soy el director de todo esto.
Everything is natural.
Est un Umi, un peu de passion. Just a little passion, okay? Okay.
Yeah.
Roger that.
Okay. Everything is natural, everything is unnatural. In May 1983, the Tasmanian Hydroelectric Commission, backed by the Tasmanian government, ceased work on the Franklin Dam. After years of waging a political campaign and makeshift water assault on the workers of the hydro, the Green lobby had won. A dam which proposed jobs and power for 10 years in a struggling Tasmanian economy at the cost of changing the river and affecting the integrated ecosystem would not be built. The romanticized image of pure, untouched nature disseminated by the Green lobby takes advantage of the prevailing heteronormativity of the 1970s, where the natural is placed on a sacred pedestal. In doing so, the other is formed and excluded. A new understanding of natural in its affected state is necessary. To be natural is to have derived from nature without having been made or caused by humans. In the current Capitalocene, everything has been influenced by human activity. Nature as natural no longer exists. The dam on the river is as natural as the river it is on. Nothing in the world is as it was pre-human.
The workers of the hydro are disregarded by the Green lobby's desire for their nature, the river, to be preserved so their children can look at it later. Just 8 years earlier, Colour TV was introduced to Australia. A nuclear family in Sydney sit down for NewsHour. Their neighbours follow suit. In a beige, off-the-plan room, a small green window pumps images live and direct from the Wilderness Society. The Wilderness Society's meticulous media campaign penetrating into Australian living rooms facilitated the general public's desire for escape. A small dose of endorphins released at the thought of being alone in nature, never mind the million others with the same thought. This escapism in the mind of the everyday Australian feels almost an essential duty when the nature is under threat from the evil hydro. The supporters of the lobby are free to academically engage in the matter, whilst the workers of the hydro have no freedom of choice. If we are to prevent the impending climate emergency, does the reason for doing so, our anthropocentric motivations, matter?
What does not appear on the nightly news is the belovedness of the Hydro Commission to the Tasmanian people. Today, it can stand as it is, a golden relic of nostalgia. The gluttonous yellow inflatables of the Green lobby spread into a living room. The standardized golden steel structure fits through any domestic doorway. The inflatables attempt to engulf an individual user. This spatial intention is facilitated by the structure. The wrestle between these two bodies for dominance creates a space of escapism. The inflatable bulges outwards, but it is drawn back by the golden steel. The inflatable completely engulfs the structure. The structure emerges clean and strong.
On wheels in order to move between spaces to invade and allow escapism. Between living rooms, the Cosmogram distributes Sydney native kangaroo grass seeds, a touch of that beautiful getaway right there in the inner west. The pathway of sprouting green marks the way to domestic nuclear living rooms, where it sits comfortably amongst furniture. Here it is inflated and asserts a new territory. The Cosmogram sneaks into the living room. It then invades the minds of the domestic occupants, altering their conceptions. It moves on to the next home. This is the new natural. The natural is now. Thanks, guys. Over to you.
Thank you.
Good. Can I add something to explain the study?
Absolutely.
Okay, so as you can see, our studio is trying to teach about the idea that to teach is not a philosophical conversation, an abstract conversation about typology, etc., etc. It's much more a pragmatical conversation, a pragmatical action, trying to explain that climate change is the common ground among all of us at this moment. And this idea of climate change is something that has to be really very explicit. It's important the difference between to be explicit or no. If you remember the pornography movies, when you see something explicit, you will enjoy much more, no? And so this is idea that to be explicit in order to show that climate change is something that is related to social and ecological situations. So it is important for us in the School of Architecture not only to teach to the students and the practices of the students, but also our relationship with the audience and the society. And so it's two main ideas in our studio. One is the school is not the place of reproduction of what has been our architecture, the history of architecture. And the second question is not a philosophical research, an arts research. It's very, very specific, related to situated knowledge. No? And this, I think, it's this work with Ed and Umi about this idea that how architecture could add to the institutions that are fighting for climate change and to help to build what Bruno Latour is talking about, that climate change needs a new institution. No?
I want to welcome Daniel Barber, that is joining us from an unworldly hour from the East Coast of the States. Thank you for the amazing effort, Daniel.
Great to be here. Yeah, thank you.
How are you?
Good.
And open up the conversation. I think it kind of, as you see, we're jumping in kind of almost schizophrenic manner from kind of the different kind of stream directions of the studio. So again, don't hesitate to comment on the projects, on the briefs, or larger kind of arguments about what it means to teach in currently, as Jose Maria was already doing.
Sorry, are you asking me to jump in this moment, or?
Delighted if you do it, but if you're like overwhelmed,
no, it's just I just arrived. I'd love to see some of the work. I just kind of picked up on the last bit about placing climate change in the center of the discussion, which of course I'm very happy to hear, and look forward to seeing how it plays out in some of the.
No, I was not asking specifically you. I was kind of telling the kind of the cohort of please don't feel intimidated.
I can jump in because I think that, well, first, the two presentations that we saw, they were really extremely interesting and really well presented. The last one in particular, I wanted to congratulate the students to be able to keep on producing things, I guess, from home, because all the scenes at the back were domestic scenes, and it's something that I experienced with my own students at GSAP, that due to the new scenario, we needed to build from home, and how that has an impact on architecture production. And I think that we have to be really creative, understanding the new conditions, and to keep on being critical and thinking and producing architecture. I would say that the conversation I wanted to go back to the general conversation about teaching, and I want to address that because I think that there's a huge risk in the conversation that we're having now to consider that typologies or materials are not political. I think that that's a really huge risk. I would consider also the two last studios, not the ones, but the previous ones, and that we were seeing more typological projects, we are understanding them as not being related with the actual crisis, and I think that that's not totally the case. The act of denial, for instance, the act of not answering to something is already a position. So I think that on that note, I would consider that, particularly, for instance, for me, the project, the studio of Fernando Abascal that proposes a public corporate, so claims to bring back a government architect offices. I think that on that kind of romantical claim to go back to another time where we have this architecture spaces that were able to operate in a territorial manner, it's definitely a reaction of the loss of the governmental power in terms of how the territory is managed. And so I think that on that note, I do think that maybe it's through typology, but it's clearly addressing a lack of architectural power in certain areas. But coming back to the idea of the typology, we look to Bernini, but and I'm saying this because we have been referring to our own architectural history, but we have to remember that those typologies and those ways of building those forms and spaces and under the sun were also deeply charged with political decisions. Bernini Piazza in front of Vatican was precisely defined with a certain type of material, the certain type of form, and the certain type of perspective in order to highlight the Pope that at that time was in a deep crisis. So form, material, and typology do have political political voices, and it's really risky to deny that.
I just want to agree with what Anna is saying very strongly as well. I think also, just as the students were speaking, also I found very beautifully presented, but these words like colonization and alien and things, when we talk about species and land, I think those things are not incidental in how we see how interconnected things are, which I think is really interesting as well. I've been reading a lot of Catherine Yusuf lately, A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, and also thinking a lot about Ruskin and how he describes atmosphere and his paintings in the industrial age that documented the change of weather, which, he really described that we are actively changing things and that the weather is inhumane and it's shaped by social forces and things. So I think, and even just reflecting on Joburg and on the students mentioned deep time and scratching the surface, where our deep time is on our surface, the meteorite strike that produced gold and sprouted up the city, then, how Black labor forces were exploited and so on. So I think that all of these factors are really super interconnected, and I know that maybe I'm stating the obvious, especially with what we're going through now with the virus, and everyone is kind of more aware of that. But I think when we have these conversations, it's really interesting to draw out and to think about the parallels of all of these factors, that nothing is in a vacuum, and that social justice issues and issues of typology and politics are very, very much interconnected with climate change, and how we treat each other and how we treat the earth is, if we look at empire and extraction and colonization, those factors are very much linked. How people saw the earth and greed and capitalism and so on, and how they treated people was also, I don't want to say the same, but the philosophy was perpetuated. The same philosophies were perpetuated.
I also have to congratulate with the students, because I think both the presentations were very well composed and also quite well combined together, because they were dealing with let's say with the similar similar issues. And I want to comment on, I took notes on the second project saying nature as natural no longer exists, which to me really belongs to, let's say, an architectural way of thinking about nature. And the second is new natural is now. And I think was the, let's say, was the strongest point of the presentation. And what I find here interesting is that somehow this notion is directly connected with a notion of power. And for this reason, I wanted to ask a question regarding the title of this project, which is the third institution. So my question would be, what is then the agency and the role of this third institution? And if it's nature, the protagonist, or humans?
I think, well, the third institution is the name of the entire studio. But for us, it's, yeah, about operating out, like understanding the institution that is at play. So looking at sort of the actors involved in, say, the Franklin River, looking at both the dam and the Wilderness Society, the Greens, and then trying to become, or like combine those sort of opposing actors into our institution, into a third institution, which is trying to create like a new history,
a new situation.
Yeah. And then that, and then in terms of that in relation to the new natural, is just, yeah, it's trying to form, like using what has happened in the past as an understanding and a new way to frame it, I guess.
I mean, I guess to sound super conservative, like any precedent study, what are your conclusions from your precedent study and how are they going to change what you do?
What precedents did we study?
Your precedent study was what happened at the Franklin River Dam and how it was stopped and the role that the yellow inflatable played, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I think, yeah, like it was that sort of the idea of like representing the small, yeah, like the inflatable in the river was this sort of like scattered, like small bodies of sort of domestic warriors taking on the hydro itself. But then that was like very perfectly, like quite meticulously planned, and how it rolled out across the nation and even across the world, and how they sort of galvanized people from home to want to be involved and sort of want to sympathize with those people, the people on the river.
I mean, I understand that, and it's really strong work, and it was really clearly presented. But in a sense, my question is more simple: is therefore what? You know, therefore, how does that get you to a position where you propose a third institution on different terms from what one might expect?
I think the way that we've approached this studio is looking at the Wilderness Society and how they almost militaristically used, I don't know, the media and the people, televisions and like domestic spaces to create this like multiplicity of bodies, even though it was all separated across across Australia. Like everyone tuned in. Everyone tuned into the news hour and were transported instantly to the Franklin River. And we wanted to look at how they might have had similar motives to like a lobbyist group almost. We don't want to portray them as this pure good heroes, and how we could use those, I guess, this understanding of the agents in these activist groups and unpack like the good and bad dichotomy even, and how we can translate that to like a contemporary institution.
Yeah, like questioning what their intentions are and whether those intentions matter in terms of trying to use it in a contemporary situation to tackle, let's say, climate change, or just like immediate and like specific ecological threat rather than sort of climate change as a whole.
Myself. I had to keep doing this thing to be able to finish. I think this is, again, all these conversations should be there and keep adding. We're gonna move to the next session with Matthew Curry from Miguel Rodriguez Casillas studio, Dirty Talks. Matthew, are you around?
I am around, and I'm going to start my video, but my internet is rubbish. I'm in Sydney, so
okay.
If it does go a little bit haywire, then I apologize. I've got somebody else that's sharing screen. Urtzi, if you don't mind, for our presentation, because we're a group of 15, is it okay if they release their videos and audio in case we need to jump in?
Yeah, absolutely. What do you mean with release? They're going to be accessible.
Oh, they can press it? Okay, that's cool. That's cool. That's fine. They can jump in then.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Are you ready, Sidi?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Amazing. Dirty Talks is a fundamental studio that considers architecture as an endangered species. We anthologize the culturally subjective dimension of architecture as an aesthetic experience, completely autonomous from practicality. In a single group of 15 students working on one project, we propose an eschatological museum at Middlehead Reserve in Mossman. This museum is both about the messiness of production as much as it is about the end of times. We extracted values from precedent buildings, and we extracted them through the lens of affects, both affinity and abjection effects. We value both equally. As part of the process, we produced effect drawings, which showed us exactly what was happening in the effect. We produced an apparatus drawing, which showed us how this was being achieved. And then finally, we wrote a curatorial narrative that explained exactly why we subjectively believe that this is of value to be kept as a memory of architecture. "15 students collectively produced 60 values in 1 week. We then auctioned off these 60 values as a collective. We ended up with 35 values, and these 35 values became part of our first iteration of the site plan. "15 site plans were then produced by 7 groups in 1 more week that were then auctioned off in the same process as the value extraction process that took place previously. This took us to the mid-semester review. Among others, the feedback revealed that we were still site designing, something we've been doing throughout our entire studio careers or professional careers. We weren't curating yet. So we revisited, we tried again. And that's okay because we're disaffectionate with our designs. This is part of our process. It turned out to be quite an important step. We recognized something about the site. A couple of us visited, which were fortunate enough, or who were fortunate enough. We now, as a result, have a curatorial action based on what we recognized when we attended that site and from what we read. We have a curatorial action based on the invasions that have taken place on this site. The first of which is colonization as a political intention. The second is the militarization that has been used as a tool and excuse for colonization to oppress and inflict violence in order to defend what is considered owned land. The third is the consumerization of this very thing that establishes an economy. And the fourth is the invisibilization and visibilization process that has been keeping this ideology alive. It keeps it going. This is ahistoric. It's happening right now and still happening. These four types of invasions are historical phases on the site. Anything that we produce on this site is an invasion. We make no excuse about that. We know that. We acknowledge that. The autonomy of architecture is absolutely challenged in this instance by the legacies of Middlehead Reserve and other instances. So architecture is an endangered species, but it is also an invasive species. It doesn't mean that we do nothing. Part of our translation of our curatorial strategy onto the site means that we start with anchor points of existing values on site. Part of the value extraction process, one of the precedents was the site itself. And now we're anchoring on those parts of the site. The museum then becomes an epistemological machine that grows inward towards itself. By anchoring on the site and invading with the extracted values, the invader becomes invaded in a mutant reversibility. The perpetual invasion creates dialogue between the curatorial body and its environment. And in doing so, we subvert the dichotomy between beauty and ugliness, sacrosanct and the profane. We now remain as a single group, sorry, City, click, yeah. We now remain as a single group of 15, working on a single project, but now we rotate around various roles. Lyrical representation, physical mechanisms, site plan, one-to-one mock-up, which has changed slightly, systems integration, and we can't wait to see what happens in this incredibly, sorry Angelo, slow, valuable process that is what we're calling architecture. Thank you.
Thank you. Where I am for myself. Here I am. So. Hello. I'm mute now. Okay, we're going to continue. Thank you very much. We're going to continue with Jason Choi from Mark Ragged, Lonesome Stranger, Mark Ragged and Matt Austin, Lonesome Stranger Studio. So Jason, whenever you're ready.
Yes. Sorry. You guys can see the screen? Yeah.
You can see it.
Okay. So just like a few other students, I would like to use the SuperCrit as a platform to not only showcase my work, but also the work of the students within the studio. So I think this will bring a larger variety and understanding to the issues that the studio is tackling. And so the studio focuses on the notion of aloneness and loneliness. And with the current pandemic we are all in, COVID-19, it has forced some of us in situations where we are alone. And this begins to affect our daily activities and relationships we develop and maintain during this time. Whilst being home alone may be comfortable and ideal, for others it may be lonely. And this feeling of loneliness is a complex issue in a way that it resonates further than just isolation and the physical presence of others. Thus the studio questions what makes us lonely, and is there something we can do about it? Skyscraper has a history of being a problematic archetype. It densely populates our cities and will be tackled to be the final design topology for executing our ideas. The strategies that we employ to tackle the issue of loneliness need to first be explored outside of the archetype. We need to first expand on conventional methods in order to truly understand its complexities. The challenge is the eventual translation of these ideas into an archetype that city so clearly relies on. We need to be critical on how we all perceive the definition of loneliness, as it affects us all in different ways. And so we've learned about the notion in different mediums, from film, lecture, and deconstructed its ideas and expressed them in a form of an artwork, a drawing, or within an essay. As a student from our class, Troy defines it as a feeling like I shouldn't be somewhere at a particular moment in time. I believe the connection to place comes first, then the connection to people follows. Our final designs for the mid-semester were to design spaces to hold activities to the stranger. These range from a space for listening, a space for swimming, to a space for proposal. Once we begin to understand how these activities are performed, it ultimately reveals how we interact, behave, and feel towards the space and the individual. David's approach looks at redefining the stereotype of the activity to create an unusual encounter and essentially establish a new norm of social interaction. My understanding of loneliness extends beyond the lack of physical contact, but towards a lack of belonging, a lack of being able to relate and contribute to an everyday environment. My design blends the mental threshold between what is familiar and uncanny in order for the stranger to truly establish their own meaning of the space. They're able to create their own sense of inclusion to a space that seemingly has no predefined function. By deforming a personal object such as a table and inserting banal objects to a large proportion, it allows the stranger to feel curious. It opens up the opportunities to feel included in what is familiar and uncanny. The familiar is what begins these relationships. The curious accelerates them, and the uncanny creates diversity and new opportunities. A place for fighting and protesting next to a sculptural representation of a key political figure, such as Scott Morrison, invites people who are fighting for similar values or disagreements. However, the duality of the sculpture head is able to contain a space where people may want to listen as they are not ready to participate yet. On the other hand, Sarah's proposal for fighting is expressed differently, as she believes loneliness is understood through the lens of its invisibility and the potential of the trace left from one stranger to the next. The space provides users the opportunity to leave a form of vandalism, giving them a sense of control. The familiar and the uncanny are what I believe drives, strengthens, and establishes relationships. Relationships between the individual and the space, or between the individuals. Loneliness is driven by the lack of relationships, the lack of inclusion, the lack of being unable to share the familiar and the uncanny with the space or individual. Highway 86 uses the highway as a familiar object and deforms the geometry in a way that the character of the object is intact and the space becomes curious to the stranger. Within the section, site architects are able to organize the uncanny, being objects that you don't see every day, the helicopter and the submarine. The curious objects where you don't see the full object, and the familiar objects in curious spaces, the everyday types of transport on a wave-like geometry. This creates a constructed journey amongst a collection of ambiguous objects to create a series of continuous exercises that jug the feeling of being familiar, being curious, and being uncanny. Highway 86 uses the object's scale and rearranges them spatially to create a variety of public spaces. It uses the meaning of the object being the car to mask the overall intention of the space. Even though the three cars are just three cars, the stranger is able to familiarize themselves with the object and establish their own space, whether it is sitting on the hoods of the cars or sitting on the highway and using the cars for shade. The submarine of Highway 86 sits on one of the lower elevations, but due to its largeness, it is able to give the user an overlook of the highway. The object itself becomes a place. The stranger has understood its character and height advantage and established that this is an ideal meeting place. Whilst we deconstruct architectural precedents to understand the spaces themselves, we also begin to look at how these notions of aloneness and loneliness can be conveyed through a different apparatus, analyzing a series of films and understanding the visual techniques deployed. Peter Greenaway uses the object not merely for its function and decoration, but as a symbolic gesture to invoke the individual. A lot of his scenes are constructed like a painting and tends to make you question the normalcy of it all. He uses objects that are familiar to the individual, but positions and frames them in a way that is curious and uncanny. For one of our first tasks, we were asked to design a space for the alone. And whilst the loneliness is not by choice, to be alone is. We designed a music space that is surrounded by a series of mirrors to give the stranger the feeling of being outside, inside. The mirrors of the space initially were to reflect a natural environment. However, the mirrors could be seen as a simulacrum, a series of panels that each represents someone or something. We began to do analysis on if the space was to be inserted into a cityscape, to potentially see how the mood or atmosphere of the space would change, and begin to blend these two environments to reappropriate what is real and what isn't. The space surrounded by panels of nature, but surrounded by cityscape. Each panel begins to represent an object of the environment. Whilst the natural shows gum leaves, branches, the sky, the city reveals architectural elements, such as the crossbeam or the brick archway. And while some objects are more identifiable than others, mixing the two environments creates a new experience, blending what is familiar and uncanny. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's kind of, I was thinking when I was putting these two studios together about how they were engaging with questions of collectivity and loneliness, and it's been amazing that that have been the two studios that have decided to include every single student in the presentation. So it's already saying something about how this question is addressed by the studios. But I would like to open to the jurors with comments and little advice. Can you share the screen, please, Jason?
Yep.
Just one at a time, please.
Yeah.
I can jump in.
I guess we solved architecture then, right? Well done, Jason.
Just following on the last presentation, I'm really taken by the sort of uncanniness of the skyscraper. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit, and you'll forgive me if I'm sort of catching up a little on the general sort of thrust of the project. Sorry, there's a large truck going by. If you could elaborate a little bit on how you see the kind of experience of the interior transforming with this uncanniness. I'm thinking not only of its kind of formal conditions, but if there's a sort of thermal uncanniness or some form of kind of, you know, not only just the kind of spatial conditions of that interior, but also its materials, its heat or coldness, its humidity, right? Its access to the kind of the membrane that protects it or releases it to the outside, et cetera. If these are of interest to the development of the project.
Oh wow, yeah. I never really thought about the thermal conditions. I guess I was really focused on the object and how we begin to familiarize ourselves and try to distinguish the relationship between our memories and the object. But yeah, the thermal condition. I'm not sure.
Yeah, fair enough. To be continued.
Yeah, sorry.
No worries.
I have a comment. I have two comments. One is about the fact that I found extremely interesting to see in the last project the example of the San Girolamo in the office, let's say, in this painting by Antonello da Messina, because it's first of all one of my favorite paintings. But what is interesting, I think, about that precise painting is that it's simultaneously an individual and also a collective space, because it's really like designed for one, but on the other side it has a multi-scalar approach, because it has, if you look at it, it also has animals in it, it has food, and it's not clear if it's an interior or an exterior. And this reminds me a lot of our condition now, being completely, let's say, multi-scalar, individual and collective, and being completely confused about that. So I think that that example is quite poignant at the moment. So I'm happy to have seen that. I have congratulations for both of the projects. I think they are both extremely interesting and very complex in terms of, and very ambitious somehow. Also, I have a stupid question regarding the background of the arches. and if there's a meaning and if it's connected with the presentation.
Tim, did you want to take this one away?
So the arches is actually one of the values that's kind of really was defining of our previous mid-semester site plan. But generally, yeah, it's just a part of our structure that we're sitting in at the moment.
We thought it would be a nice touch to add the colours of the eschatological remains that we were talking about originally. And I'm glad that I froze now rather than before.
Yeah.
I would like to expand on that, not on the arches themselves, but the format of that the studio for me was really interesting. I think one of the values of the Supercrit is precisely to talk about pedagogy, to talk to see have to have this transversal look through all the studios and to be aware of what is being produced, and also pedagogy. So I think that the Dirty Talks studio is precisely interesting in its format by the fact that it's asking a really difficult thing to do, that is to work 15 or I don't know how many people together.
15.
That's quite a large number, and I think that it has a good also balance in relation with the references. So the through talking and through conversation, you have been forced to define what is architecture by the use of the term value, and I think that it has a lot of potentiality. The fact that one is forced to design individually at the same time collectively, because through that simple format, your projects will never be detached from a contextual scenario. Architecture is never can never be understood as an absolute, as an isolate entity. That's a thing that, graphically speaking, has been empowered in the last 15 years or 20 years, and it has a lot of risk. So just by the fact that your project per se, by the format of the studio, are going to be related with other projects, empowers this idea of architecture being always a relational discipline, which is obviously, again, politics, materiality, territory, etc., biases are always interlinked.
No, I would like to jump to the conversation, and following this amazing point of Anna, I would like to just introduce just a point about the idea of the museum. Museum for me, I don't want to do with my intervention a philosophical speech. I think we don't need a philosophical conversation, we need grammatical, I have explained. So, but what I want to remark that the museum, it's historically has been a specific building to exclude the otherness in some way. No, always museum has been a representation based on the concept of exclusion. The exclusion. This is the good. This is the best. This is the good. You have to reproduce. You have to rethink about this. What exists in the museum. This is the role of the museum, from the bourgeois, from the historically, and so this is something that has changed at this moment, no? Because instead of the idea of exclusion, we are working with the idea of inclusion, and so this is an important point. Inclusion it means really to be totally open about the concept of everything, from species, from history, from future, and from the past, no? And so this I think is the challenge that you this project has just to face just in front of them, no? And then this is a question that Matthew, if you are thinking about how to include this kind of new inclusion in this in this topic. No?
Matthew, it's really nice to see you again. Hi.
Oh, I was gonna say thank you. I was actually gonna message you and say it's nice to see you, but I wasn't sure if it's appropriate to put it in the chat.
Thanks. It's nice. It's lovely to see you too. I really enjoyed both the presentations. As everyone is saying, I think it's really interesting to see how you've been making collectively in isolation, which is really inspiring and incredible. I just have some quick reflections. I guess they aren't really questions or comments, but I found this idea of making such a declarative manifesto through making architecture really compelling. I think so often architecture is trying, or architects are trying not to engage, especially in my context. And I think that this idea is really interesting. And I also found it interesting reflecting on the previous presentation, which was about making, or which touched on making architecture through words. I think to think about those two things in parallel could be really interesting. So in your group presentation, I imagine that the words that you would use are really different to the presentation that we saw earlier, because your declarations are very different. But I wonder if you could think through on such an architectural level as well with words. I don't know, I'm just reflecting on this idea of the manifesto that I'm reading in your work, and I think it could be really interesting to also make architecture with words, not make a manifesto with words, but also to think about describing the conditions that you're making and what those spaces feel like as well. Because I think there's a lot that's very organizational and so on that's really interesting in how you're looking at things. And I think it could also start to draw on being more atmospheric and more, I don't want to say architectonic, but touch on the other areas of architecture, and maybe an entry point for that is through words. And then Jason, I just quickly want to reflect on Corona and what we're going through now in Johannesburg, because I found I was reading everything through this situation and this really interesting set of takes, critiques, and speculations on being together. So where I am, and I'm sure lots of you have read articles about similar places in the world, but we have in the suburbs like a quarantine light situation. So people have lots of space and gardens, living maids, tennis courts, like all the rest in their homes in some areas. And then in other areas, the other extreme of people living on top of each other in super dense environments where self-isolation just isn't possible at all. And as I was looking at your drawings, it reminded me very much of things I've been thinking about, how we can start to relook at things we already have in new ways and how they can be programmed differently. So yeah, I just wanted to say that that's super interesting, because I think that again, we're talking about, dichotomies and inequalities and so on. But I think that to think through scenarios where things are really blurred and hybrid. So in really dense environments, how do you still create softness? I know these are obvious things, but I think they're being brought more sharply into focus now. And it's really interesting to see how you're thinking about it as well.
To keep going and unless some final comments for this group, and we're gonna move to the next session with Edward Humphreys from Brooke Jackson Domestic Formalities. Ed, are you ready?
Yes, I'm here. Hi, how are you? Hi, so I'm Edward. I'm in Brooke Jackson's Domestic Formalities. I guess I'll just get started. All right, is that working for everyone? Okay, cool. So we define space on the body Space then comes back and redefines how a body engages from a socio and political position. We can see this in Henry Roberts' model home of 1851, which has rationalized the domestic apartment. Architecture was built on our understandings of the proportions of the Vitruvian body. This relationship was then extracted through the biopolitics of Victorian capitalism to produce the model home. The relationship between body politics and space has been simplified to the point where housing is now designed for furniture. Furniture exists as a simplification and representation of the Vitruvian body and the home, as evident in the modern apartment design guide. These methods of structural absolutism, the wall, the corner, the corridor, and the enclosure, define space according to these politics. They enforce the binaries of the absolutist human body. They distinguish the internal from the external, the domus from the city, and the human from nature. Furthermore, as evident in Henry Roberts' model home, they enforce and segregate the binaries of gender as well as those of youth and maturity. In performing the charrette task assigned to our everyday encounter, I realized my own domestic scenario, which is built of 3 walls and a window. I was interested in the mediation between my moment of domesticity and the world beyond. George Tussaud suggests the window exists as a product of gaze and reflection. The apparatus of the window informs this gaze, and the idealized domestic condition is projected onto the outside through the window. Trying to understand this idealized domesticity and the values our domestic projects as essential, I was drawn to Guy Debord and the Society of the Spectacle. The systems of wants, desires, and needs enforced by the window through the reciprocity of gaze and reflection have powerful biopolitical connotations in our protection of binary segregations. Similarly, in my own situation, the modernist glass facade of my own house was only enhancing the Victorian values and rules of the model home. I want to flirt with this division and engage with the apparatus as a tool which instead bleeds and blurs the relationship of the body political, the domestic, and the city. Taking away from the binary, what if we start to engage with the idea of the system? I'm going to bring it back to the body for a minute through my own experience with my body and gender, as well as the scenographic work of academics such as Rachel Han and queer crip theory. The body is no longer an absolute. The body is instead could be considered an assemblage of systems. If there is not a series of rules which we have to abide by in terms of physical logic and proportion of space, how can we start to rationalize the domestic as fitting into this fluid assembly of systems? How can we engage with the fluidity of systems as a whole, and how can we break down the cause and effect of these systems in a new domestic? So if we're no longer about the binaries and we're about the fluid systems, I started through the examination of the propositions shown. I tried to dissect and unpack the boundary lines, strategically examining thickness, porosity, and permanence. These lines, however, exist without bodies. By bringing the body back to these actions, can these propositions connect with fluid systems of body assemblage? So then, in conjunction with the studio, we began to dissect the spaces of the home. By retrospectively examining the culture of the bed through art, the potentiality to reappropriate and re-understand the bed has materialized. I then began to examine how a space could operate which enabled the fluidity of relationships between object and the systems of body. So for this example, how could a bed engage with the individualized spectacle of desire and hormonal systems of lust and taste? Could the radical reappropriation of boundary, window, and privacy offer a new type of domesticity? Moving to the next phase, the fluid systems of the new domestic are being applied to the scale of the block and the city. As a studio, we have begun to unpack the relationship of program and privacy in the Roman insulae. We have then begun to apply some of these strategies to our site at the closing Powerhouse Museum just down on Harris Street. As a class, we are beginning to collectively develop a new master plan for the controversial site. Our plan aims to offer and suggest the exciting potential and possibilities of a new system of domesticity for the controversial development. Thank you.
working on the powerhouse now. Yeah, that's cool.
Thanks, Edward. So Adelaide and Marnie, are you ready from Andrew Daly Studio and Eduardo Fernandez Story Logical? Yeah, please go. Go ahead, Marnie.
We're ready. Cool. So, hi, Addie and I have been working together in Andrew and Edward's studio, Never Ideological.
Good. Go ahead, you got.
Oh, sorry. Never Ideological challenges the continued extension of the suburbs through the mechanism of development. We're working on sites around Sydney that are identified as being endangered typologies of suburbia. In this case, water towers and substations. These are sites that are large, suburban, publicly owned, and house redundant infrastructures. As technology is constantly being miniaturized, these endangered typologies are under threat of being sold off to private developers. So our studio's aim is to protect these suburban anomalies from privatization by occupying the sites with public schools and attached civic programs. Each project from our studio proposes that these endangered typologies should stay in public ownership and be retained as punctuations rather than continuations of the expansions of the suburbs. Our infrastructure is Ashfield Reservoir. It's a heritage monument built in 1901 and it's formally heritage listed. It's worth noting that the DA for this site has just been submitted about a month ago and it will be a privately owned low density residential project. Addie?
So the studio began by doing photographic investigations of each site. As we studied the Ashbury, we were drawn to what Robin Boyd would have condemned as the cult of featureism and the elements that Adolf Loos would have described as a crime. However, as they condemn this, we believe it should be celebrated as it reveals the pride residents have in their homes and also provides a glimpse into the multicultural, multi-generational, inclusive communities of Sydney. This language of suburbia is integral to residents creating their own sense of identity, culture, and uniqueness while taking pride in their community. Well, there's almost a cultural appropriation of landscapes, personalized annotation of facades, and in doing so, it romanticizes the front street gardens. In addition, we looked at two aspects of civicness in Ashfield. Firstly, the shopping centre that exists with its back to the people as a Pebble Creek monument, and its monumentality is the only nearby structure that rivals the water tower. The second aspect that we studied is a truly Australian seeming architectural element, the awning. It facilitates civicness down every main street in Australia, and it creates a shared space for all citizens and sometimes their pets to participate in activities. Arriving at the site itself, the water tower seems to exist with many elevations as a backdrop against backyards or as a hidden object amongst trees. The studio continued by developing photo manipulations alongside plans and sections. These are some earlier attempts of our project. This one is one looking from the park towards the school. Here we study the suburban scale. And then we continue on by looking at the interior views that helped us understand scale and materialities of the design.
This is our school as it stands now, and we'd like to introduce it as an all-accessible primary school that caters to people with and without disabilities, referring to it as Brickfield School and Centre for Learning. This is our site plan. So what we've realised is that the public school delivered by the government for public benefit is a typology that can accommodate public use beyond the cold, private, cut up and sell logic of the expanding suburbs. Our school is designed so that the civic functions are on the street front while allowing the classrooms to overlook the park, encompassed in a brick envelope that explores the featureism and Ashfield brick treatment that we've identified through our photographic report. This is our plan. So we've implemented a strategic cul-de-sac centric design strategy, extracted from the domesticity of Ashfield and adapting several strategies from the Miles School, Geraldine Primary School and Marawina Long Daycare. We've created these community spaces and composite class learning. As you can see, we have these internal streets that lead into our cul-de-sac spaces for collective learning, stemming off the main streets, acting as common areas. The classroom clusters around these cul-de-sacs, with each classroom having its own aspect to a courtyard. And we really hope that this language creates a sense of ownership for each class and ultimately a community across the neighborhood and a greater sense of community across the entire school. But as a fundamental studio, we continue to develop our project through the resolution of details. The beauty of Ashfield for us was the featurism, the brick treatment, and the variation in scale from its civic program to its domesticity. These are the principles that we applied when addressing our two programs. Our civic program is the school library, also acting as the public learning space. We imagine it to be quite grand in scale and space, celebrating the verticality of the reservoir. In contrast to our civic program and language, which speaks to the monumentality of the tower and Ashfield's civic programs, our classroom celebrates the domestic scale and kitschness of Ashfield and its public presence that we really love, speaking the same architectural language in a slightly different dialect. All the schools in our studio are a provocation that the suburbs can engender a new kind of suburban civicness by saving these endangered sites through public intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this group is clearly cited. In a way, it's cited in Sydney or in New South Wales, and I think that the kind of one of the frames of the discussion I was foreseeing. But I want to open up to jurors to continue the conversation.
It's difficult. I have a question. I have a question for the first project, and then also a comment on the second project. Regarding the first project, what I found quite interesting is that at one point you say that the body is not an absolute entity, but it's an assemblage of systems.
Yeah.
Which, let's say, entails an interesting point also that can be translated into space.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so I was wondering how you apply this concept to then the space you're thinking about. If it's something that you imagine it. I know it's very difficult.
So yeah, I guess it's quite hard just where we're at this semester, but what I've been trying to do is kind of unpack the relationship between this existing body political and our space. So like, that's why was looking at kind of the role of the boundary and the opening and all these things. So I guess in terms of moving forward, it's about kind of producing like a system of radical potentiality and almost like a I will have to get back to you on the kind of defined, I guess, how that will look. But I think what I'm trying to do at the moment is I've tried to unpack the way it exists currently and that relationship. And I think moving forward, it will be about like kind of reappropriating that relationship. So reappropriating and the role of the window and the relationship of the wall and the corner and the boundary to this assemblage of systems. So yeah, I guess I'd love feedback and help with this because it's very, you know, it's a massive kind of thing, but yeah, I think it's going to be, I guess it will have to operate as a system essentially as well.
I think that the way
I can follow.
No, go ahead.
No, Matilde, please go.
No, I just wanted to say that this idea of assemblage of systems describing the body is a very architectural one. So maybe this can help you.
No, I think that's why I chose that term.
I wanted to try to be of help. First, congratulations to Edward and the studio at large. I'm obviously quite aligned with the studio because the topics that are addressed are topics that I like to address in my own studio. So that's evident that I'm quite a fan of Brooke's work. But Edward, hi again, by the way.
Hello, nice to see you again, long time.
Nice to see you. I would recommend you because it's obviously a really difficult topic to touch, because it's a topic that it's evolving now. It's extremely contemporary, and therefore it's really difficult to deal with it. But 4 years ago at Columbia, at GSAPP, there was a group of students that started an initiative to boost not only gender studies, but Q studies, etc. It is called Q Space. They do have a web page. This year they have decreased a little bit the work. I don't know why. They do have an Instagram, and I do totally encourage you to be in touch with them and look what they do, because it can be helpful. For instance, one of the amazing projects, they do research in relation with that. And one of the amazing projects that they pushed was a research based on looking at how plumbing, such a domestic thing as plumbing, was, so they were looking to plumbing codes in the US. Just looking to plumbing codes in the US, they unveil a lot of problematics in relation with gender and plumbing and domestic plumbing. So I think probably to look to their researches that obviously are based in the US, but you can, use as a reference to push your project, might help you to unveil this complex domestic system that engages the body in a further manner.
Fantastic, thank you so much. I appreciate that. That's really useful.
I also really enjoyed it. I just want to ask Edward, what are you reading at the moment?
So pretty much last semester I did a lot of work on queer theory. And so I've read a lot of Jack Halberstam. So like Gaga Feminism, Testo Junkie. I've read, oh God, I've got it up there. What is it? Sorry. Can I just check? It's in my bookcase.
No, it's okay. Don't worry. It's fine. It's okay.
Pornotopia. Pornotopia was a really good one. Sorry, I couldn't keep going if I didn't figure out what that was. So that's kind of the stuff I've been reading for the last, I guess, 6 months now, essentially, and trying to kind of unpack that relationship between these things and architecture is really interesting and really challenging and exciting.
Yeah. Super interesting. I'm really glad to hear what you're reading. So you'll be very familiar with the phrase, the body as a site for identity to pass through, which I think is really, but I guess I don't have much to ask, but just want to commend you on the subject matter, and also maybe to think about thinking through some queer theory that's a little bit more retro, like Donna Haraway and the Cyborg, and maybe also, I don't know, I don't want to say Betsky, but Betsky and Susan Sontag, and this idea of the sites of the domestic as spaces of everyday resistance, which I think is something that's really interesting for, often queer theory, feminist theory, marginal theory is all very overlapping in strategy. And with my work in London at the moment, I've also been looking at sites of the domestic as sites of everyday resistance for communities which are marginalized. And I think thinking about, this because that makes the idea immediately very spatial. I'm not offering anything, but I think—
No, this is really helpful, thank you.
I think maybe, beyond thinking about the allegorical, which is, could be very beautiful in terms of what you described about walls and corners and so on, to think about how the politics of the body is freed up in the space, or is, just how the space also allows certain things to be uncovered, like what Anna was saying about the plumbing, but also everything which you touched on in the beginning, like the Vitruvian Man and how it's related to eugenics and so on. Like everything about architecture is embedded in a really ugly patriarchy.
Absolutely.
So I think that on one hand, it could be a really beautiful and very speculative work about fluidity of space, but also I think to remember that what you are doing is having a really critical eye on forms of patriarchy. And I think that those two things together could be really interesting to look at. So one aspect of your work might be super analytical, where you do kind of deconstruct and start to uncover how all these layers are so, you know, embedded in us, and they're so subconscious, but what those start to, what kind of values they entrench. And then on the other hand, to also be super allegorical and to draw fluidity and to draw blurring and so on.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think with some of the retro references, it might also be interesting to take them and then kind of rewrite them in your own,
Absolutely.
your own values and manifestos. I think that would also be really interesting because.
Fantastic. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Oh, brilliant. No, thank you for that. That's really helpful.
I just want to jump in quickly to support those comments. I thought that was a really great intervention. And I would just add briefly the work of Mackenzie Wark as a way to maybe even bridge some of the sort of retro to the non-retro series in that regard. Wark indeed in his book Molecular Red sort of does an analysis of Haraway, right? So explicitly kind of bringing it into a contemporary discourse, but also is focused on a connection between, let's say, a sort of a premise that frames infrastructure as a form of patriarchal engagement, right? So bringing in technology, bringing in different forms of knowledge, and also sort of conditions of infrastructure that might help make some kind of translations to architecture, if you will. So I think
fantastic.
Her work would be quite useful for you. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I'm delighted to hear. Sorry. To hear Daniel bringing in infrastructure for this conversation about your work, Edward, because I actually think it's really crucial, and Anna has already touched on it in relation to plumbing. I mean, in a sense, for our guests, this is a studio that's precisely dealing with the infrastructure of regulations that rights housing and very particular regulations here that right housing here. And so you know, in a sense, if you talk about gender as an assemblage of, you're talking about the body as an assemblage of systems, I think you're really talking about gender as an assemblage of systems. And there's the potential that you start to examine the interface between the systems that organize gender and the systems that are the infrastructure that underpin housing form and housing policy. So I'd kind of encourage you to step away from the window and step away from the gaze that has been done.
Yeah.
And is not the kind of, in a sense, the area of specialization of the studio that you're in, which I think goes into a much more original and much more interesting area, which is to do with a kind of systems thinking about the regulatory and behind them or ahead of them as manifest from the technological infrastructures that underpin housing. And those absolutely intersect with the infrastructures and the systems that write gender, that attempt to fix gender. So if you can use gender fluidity to disrupt those infrastructures and to kind of suggest what that might mean in terms of a kind of fluid infrastructure of not only gender systems, but all the other infrastructures behind housing, I think you're onto something super interesting.
Fantastic, thank you very much.
So I guess we need to move on to the school. Gender has hijacked the day. Where are you, Marnie? I've lost you from my screen.
Hi.
Hi, both of you. I really love the photographs. There's so much in those photographs, such a kind of really subtle analysis of the construction of taste in the environment that you're working in that somehow is slipping away when in the way that you're representing the school. And I mean, I know from the photographs that your eye is there and you've seen that, and you've seen the kind of featureism, as you called it. And I'm wondering where, you know, what role that starts to play in the articulation of the school, in the articulation of the tasteless children doing their tasteless things in the tasteful school, in the tasteless suburbia. I mean, you know, in a sense, it's not simply at the architectural level, but it's at the level of all of the furniture and objects and drawings and all the things that make up the environment of a primary school that are so extraordinary. So there's somehow that there was things about some of the composition of the photographs that almost looked like the corner of a giant space in which children might have been playing and just left it, and they left the water tower just there behind the house, which has a stupid angel just in front of it. And I think there's something in that aesthetic, that there's a kind of vernacular there that you could mine really effectively in terms of a primary school environment, because actually they have a lot of connection aesthetically, coincidentally.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Thank you. I just want to add to that quickly. I feel the same as what Francesca's saying as well. I also really enjoyed the photos and the humor in them. And as we looked at them, I wrote down suburban super typologies. And I think if you could think about this, yeah, the idea of taste is really interesting. And I think thinking through how we maybe, I don't know, are not so, not dismissive, but maybe judgmental towards certain forms of suburbia, like the drive-through, the petrol station, these backyards you're talking about, all these forms of ornamentation as well. Because I think that maybe it's really interesting to think through like a mashup of all of these things and then how they perform and play out. And so almost to use suburbia against suburbia. Be really interesting. And also I think that for me is a much more interesting provocation on community that you talked about. So you talked about these courtyard spaces, which is lovely, but I think thinking through identity of a space a little bit less, I don't want to say judgmental, but maybe a bit more with the ethos of what's in your photos and with that spirit could be really great.
Yeah, commenting on that, and talking about taste, I found a very tasteful way of designing the school. I think the school Marni was showing is extremely beautiful project, both in terms of facades and in terms of plan. And so I think you managed to somehow translate this tasteless taste into something tasteful. Or in general, like I need to congratulate with you because I found it a very nice also architectural project per se.
Thank you so much.
I think I'm gonna kind of we're gonna move to the last block, the kind of the closing block actually, with William Roberts, Declan, and Joel with the project for James Melson and Penny Allen Fire. So I haven't seen Joel around, but William, you're there. So if you want, who's gonna? So if you want to go ahead, please.
Yeah, I'm just sharing the screen. Can you all see the screen and hear me? Okay, so I'm William, and Declan is. The third member of our group is Joel Spring. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it this evening. However, he's going to be with us tonight from another time or dimension as his voice narrates a video, which has been edited into the presentation. So Fire. This master's studio takes as its starting point the large-scale bushfires that took place in Australia over the 2019-2020 period. Geographically, we've been looking at a small area of land on the south coast of New South Wales known as Rosedale. In the last census, there were 221 residents of the town. So far, the studio has been forensically interrogating the lead up to the fires, the effects of the fires, and the current policy involved in preventing and living with bushfire. In the context of Rosedale, much was lost. We counted around 70 ruins. We saw from the air that almost half the vegetation was touched by fire, and we heard that the forest soundscape had been muted. Through our interrogations, we are learning of the incredible complexity of the bushfire event. We have found it to have long, old roots that spread widely through the socio-political realm. The intentions of the studio is not to defend against fire, but to understand it in order to coexist. For the past 6 weeks, the class has been tasked with researching and producing a set of resources for use by the studio to go forth and inform our future design proposals this semester. In groups, we researched different temporal and spatial scales. Joel, Declan, and I were tasked with interrogating the policy conflicts surrounding the bushfire, management, and the land. As an output, we crafted a video to frame and narrate our research. The video is a bit long to show in its entirety tonight, so we have capitalized on its strengths and will use it to drive a few points in the conversation. So here's the opening clip of the video, which is narrated by Joel, and it introduces sort of the tone of our research.
After the end of the world, don't you know that yet? It's after the end of the world. Don't you know that yet? It's after the end of the world. Don't you know that yet? It's after the end of the world. Don't you know that yet?
Land is the intersection of two kinds of things. Land is an assemblage of embodied discursive acts. Land is something that we narrate and storytell about. And land is also a set of performative enactments, simply expressed by the things that we do on or do to the land. As storytellers, we create ideas about land, and we are also doing things to the land. Edward Said captured a foundational, although often ignored, component of the politics of landed property when he wrote, "The main battle in colonialism is over land, of course, but when it comes to who owned the land, who had the right to settle, who kept it going, who won it back, and who now plans its future, these issues were reflected and contested, and even at times decided in narrative. The power to narrate, or to block other narratives from forming and emerging, is very important." From the arrival of colonists in 1788 until 1830, the productivity and labour of expelled convicts and entrepreneurial freemen was concentrated towards agricultural production and cultivation of land in the southeast of Australia. The dispossession of Indigenous peoples' land was legitimised through an overriding of country with land tenure systems, property laws, and resource production that operate in this twofold logic. The introduction of the Western techniques by foreign bodies is a structure of violence towards Indigenous peoples, rendering the foundational action of settler colonialism conditional upon the elimination of Indigenous practices. But these attempts at eliminating Indigenous land management systems with colonial ones did not create financially stable or sustainable systems of land management. Planning in settler colonial countries is always taking place on lands of Indigenous peoples. While Indigenous rights, identity and culture are increasingly being discussed within planning, its mainstream accounts virtually ignore the colonial roots and legacies of the discipline's assumptions, techniques and methods. Property generally conjures a mental image of ownership and housing. In colonial liberal states such as Australia, this mental alignment of property with real estate is so powerful that the whole concept has come to encapsulate a common-sense, mundane bundle of rights that people hold towards an estate. In these cases, property is both depoliticised and normalised. It is aimed at no one in particular and available in theory to anyone. This conceptualisation of property as object, however, warrants historicisation. The problem of design, whether it is design by destruction or design by an infrastructural planning or architectural means, is a problem of government. The governing of people in space, and by extension the state, is an apparatus of government. To do this effectively, the apparatus must continually change. The act of governing in space is the act of transforming space. Within this understanding, space always exists as a static thing in which relations of power inhabit it in a particular ways, making use of the spatial characteristics. Governing in space is space in movement. The moment power operates in space is the moment it transforms it. In the wake of climate change caused by colonization, settlers literally plan how to reconstruct and therefore recolonize. It is this precise moment in which destruction as an agent of design to reorganize and change political space is most legible and poignant at the scale of the state.
In the aftermath of these catastrophic bushfires, the narratives of these lands will be restoried, retold, and thus reconstructed through the lens of two conflicting documents: the Planning for Bushfire Protection and the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. Each of these documents defines specific physical and spatial enactments on the land. In this drawing, we can see the densely wooded area of North Rosedale was the most affected part of the community. It is here we can try to show the extent of what was lost. This is another iteration of the drawing where it has been overlaid against the diverse vegetation communities recorded in Rosedale, with particular interest moving forward in observing their varying rates of recovery. Through point cloud scans of both before and after the fires, we were able to forensically assess and reconstruct the lost elements of the landscape, both artificial and natural. To help us archive the full scale of destruction through the lens of the document, and ultimately catalogue the ruins of Rosedale in their decaying stasis, now prolonged by economic uncertainty. Through the lens of the current policy, we looked to the future of North Rosedale. What if residents were followed the existing guidelines? Where would they be living?
It was here we stopped. If we're going to talk about policy, then we wanted to go into the history of these things, the history of the two lands. We drew a long section, or as Francesca said, it's more like a panorama, which explores the history in a non-linear way. We see the two mirrored drawings as footnotes to one another. We aimed to create a drawing that presented our research non-hierarchically and legibly. We added annotations and references, but we also wanted the reader of the drawing to be able to tie things together in their own way and time. The drawing looks at forestry waste disguised as animal habitat. It burns so hot, it bakes the earth for 30 meters around. It also throws balls of fire long into the distance. Underneath, the sheep have been introduced. Their little hoofs compact the soil, their little jaws wipe out the yam. Cultural burning workshops go on as the ruins lie. The more money you can spend on fireproofing your house, the closer the trees can be. Underneath, the redcoats have arrived. Assets are protected and birds fly. Lands are measured, divided, and they're sold. How far can a musket travel? Ruins lay still, insurance companies are busy, and the economy is hibernating, remember. Plants creep through the cracks. Some people use fire to reduce the hazard. Be sure to maintain a low scorch height, less than 5 meters. A scorch height can be measured to the height at which the leaves are killed by the fire. Indigenous practitioners let the fire trickle through the landscape. Read the land, wait for a storm, burn at the right time, cool and slow. And below, that's the loss that's counted, 382 homes. And just finally, a quick clip to end. Thank you for listening.
Here are 2 videos taken on the same day in March this year. On the left is the area known as Rosedale, and on the right is unburnt coastal bushland 20 kilometres away. Using a spectrograph to visualise the ambient sound, another immediate image of loss can be made.
Thank you. Jed and Callum from Grace and Dave's Death by Design. Hello. Are you ready?
Yep.
Go for it.
Thank you everyone for sticking around. So we're dealing with a different kind of crisis, a slower one. Sydney is at reaching its current capacity for burial space. These sites, like Waverley, which opened in 1878, are characterised by sprawling landscapes of overgrown lawns, crumbling graves, and usually quite barren, save for a few non-native plant species.
We have this fear that because land at any one point in time is finite, we need to stake as many claims for it as possible because our time is finite. And we create cemeteries as a result of that, which really only exacerbates the situation because all of a sudden we have the responsibility to maintain them forever, which is inappropriate because inevitably they fall into disrepair and inevitably their social function diminishes. This is one of the precedents we first looked at, which is Jean-Jacques Rousseau's tomb in France. What's critical is that it's no longer a tomb, it's an epitaph. The body's no longer there, but it still serves a social function. Visitors can pass by and contemplate, and there are sort of like layers, physical layers to get through. The island itself separates the epitaph from the visitor. and you have those sort of rows of poplars between that.
We also looked at some contemporary examples. This is Woodland Cemetery outside of Stockholm, where Leverance and Asplund carved out from an existing pine forest that had overgrown in gravel pits, various spaces, open fields, formal and informal meandering paths to allow the architecture of the landscape to shape specific journeys throughout the site.
If you look at the sequencing through that, following from bottom across to the right and then up to the next row, you can see that it's a highly curated processional beat through the site as you walk towards one of the many destinations, the Woodland Chapel, starting off completely expanded and slowly, gradually narrowing in until once the ritual is over, it explodes outwards once again as you were released into the world. If you compare that to Waverley Cemetery, it's not quite as successful. You start off compressed, quite quickly expand, and that's the state that remains across the entire site. It's clear that in this case in Australia, the infrastructure is trumping the ritual. Cramming as many graves in as possible is more important than actually appreciating the dead.
We looked at the historical conditions of the site to try and understand what can be done to mediate this sense of banality. We reproduced the pre-colonial past, looked at heath on sandstone examples from down the coast, and then also compared it to its first iteration of when the cemetery was opened. The land was cleared of native ecosystems, like much of the east coast, where the land and nature was almost completely erased. The current site plan reveals that as a lot of Sydney cemeteries have inherited these colonial systems of organising deathscapes. We see the Victorian grid and strong axes which are interrupted by roundabouts and monuments. And it's all about this escapist view of framing the view out to the ocean. And we can see that in the base we've got where this cliff has been eroding. The whole site is a geotechnical hazard. It's all collapsing, and it has this kind of duality with the speed of an ecological crisis where the site is all slowly going to be submerged and fall apart. And so,
within 50 to 100 years, it's estimated to be a likely risk to human life.
So then we started looking at what we could do with the site. So it's about reorienting and refocusing the experience of these deathscapes from the ocean to an inner reflection of the landscape and our coast and our place on this land. We realized that a lot of the site is quite redundant, where it's shaped in this bowl shape with a ridge on the top and the cliff at the bottom. And much of it could be looked at for rewilding and rehabitating. But we realized that we'd sort of allowed ourselves to be constrained by this existing landscape and felt that we needed to actually understand a bit more of the site.
This was the early mid-sem attempt. And then these were attempts that were made immediately after mid-sem.
Trying to understand the extremes of the changing site and its terrain, how the site has explored cut and fill and looking at its span and potentiality in exploring the massings.
So looking closer at the site, you start to uncover that its whole history is a history of, or at least colonial history is a history of excavation and fill, from the filling in the original gully, the ballast brought in for the roads, excavation for a local sandstone quarry that was then used for the sandstone gravestones around the site, which was then refilled so you could put graves on it. Fertile soil brought in for lawn grass, the graves themselves. The gully collapsed in 2016 and has since been re-engineered and refilled, which sort of takes away from the idea that a cemetery is an untouchable space. And so this is where we are now, maybe finally ready to start designing things. And this drawing sort of combines the remnant vegetation that is on the site, the existing planned bush regeneration zone, the areas that have already been reinforced and buttressed, the water channels, and the sort of redundant spaces that don't really contribute to what people enjoy about Waverley Cemetery.
So it's about this dual need of trying to meet this current urgent crisis, seemingly urgent, which potentially only has around 5 years left of capacity, and yet also shaping the long-term shaping of this site for the next 100 or so years. And we ask in the studio what capacity these spaces have in allowing us to contemplate our shared mortality and finite presence. And yeah, super keen to explore these in the next few weeks.
Thank you.
So comments? Sorry, this delivery guy just arrived to the front door, so I have to, sorry. Let's continue.
I'll just quickly start because I have to leave everyone. I'm so sorry. Thank you for having me. It's been a beautiful session and I've really enjoyed it. But just quick reflections on the first presentation. Both of the presentations were absolutely poetic and kind of put me in another sphere for a little bit, which is, yeah, really reflective and quite moving. Again, to mention for the second time today, Catherine Yusuf and her text on fire and on breathing, I think is very valuable for both of you to look at. And on the first presentation, I found this methodology of strata and of layering across the way that you work from the film work and also in how you construct the drawings really interesting. And I really encourage you to mine as much as you can, literally and figuratively, but in working with this idea of layering things and of things that rise to the surface and then yeah, also kind of erode. If you can start to be more explicit with that in the drawing, I think it might shift things up a little bit. But also this notion of breath, I think, can maybe add to your already very poetic readings, and that we ingest, everyone's really aware of it now with the virus, but we ingest our environments, we ingest each other, we ingest architecture. I watched a really harrowing presentation that A.L. Wiseman gave recently, and he talked about someone describing breathing in their home after a bomb and, you know, breathing in the dust of their place. And I think that, you know, reflecting on the violence of removing people from something that they have ingested through centuries of breath and then having them ingest really toxic environments is also really interesting to think through. And then, yeah, very quickly on the second presentation, also equally poetic and beautiful. I found this idea of what you said about colonization is about a cut and full strategy. Super interesting. And I think even in like how regeneration is framed, sometimes it's also about an imposition and like a very heavy-handed handing down of something. And I'm just wondering what you think could be softer alternatives to that.
I think it needs to be built into a system of a slow rewilding with either some regenerative or therapeutic, where it's part of someone's therapy, working with the ground and plants, and it's restorative, not just for a restorative landscape, not just for the dead, but for the living, if that's what you mean. Definitely rewilding is not really possible and definitely is heavy-handed because it's designed. Nothing can be restored. I guess that's kind of our position.
I mean, there's also the idea that like there are multiple stages, as we've been learning, that sort of you can retain what's existing because that is an ecology, it's just a different one. Maybe not as effective as what once was. It's not a supporting habitat for the local native ecology. You can regenerate, which is where the remnant bushland comes in, or you can replant, which is obviously the most extreme. But even to regenerate the soil on the site now is probably more fertile than what would support regeneration. So you already have to sort of strip back a layer of the earth in order to replace it, you know, which isn't a non-violent solution. It is a violent solution, but I guess like.
I'll just commend both projects for taking on some of those issues, right? And ones that, frankly, I know have a certain valence within the Australian context that make me even a bit nervous to kind of try to jump in. But I think the foregrounding land and its relationship to colonization and decolonization, and I think even in the comments that were just made in terms of recognizing well, the kind of value of different ecologies, right? That everything's an ecology. It's that in itself is merely a descriptive term, not a valued term, and how to begin to negotiate and sort of engage with the optimization of systems, right? Which ecological sciences tend to do, and who that optimization is for, and what the terms are that are justifying it, et cetera. I mean, you've opened up a, you know, kind of Pandora's box of important issues. And I guess mostly what I'm trying to commend is just the recognition that that land is not necessarily a ground in the sense of sort of a foundation of a sort of grounding gesture, but it's maybe more of a kind of recognition of the complexities of politics and the kind of layers of history. I'm just pleased to see that there's not some kind of essentialism that's being built in there, and I would just kind of run with that. In terms of kind of land as a as a political concept. Happy to follow up with some detailed references as well.
I want to follow up on that because I think it has been a great way to end the session with these last two studios. Probably because of both of them, they do have a sense of death, sense of memory, a sense of replacement, and somehow it's a feeling that we are all having these days. So not as you know, not only as an ending, but also due to its actuality. I think that both topics are extremely relevant. Beautiful. The Death Studio, the drawings were beautiful. I was extremely moved by them, but also the fire one. I wanted to both. I think that both studios are trying to talk about memory and replacement, and that's a really difficult thing to tackle. I wanted to recommend probably for both studios, but it's more easy to relate it to the fire one. The project the work done by Paulo Tavares, probably you have approached him because he was part of forensic architecture, and as you mentioned, forensic, obviously, and also the way that you have evolved your project is it's quite linked with their methodologies. But Paulo Tavares has been doing a set of projects with certain communities in the Amazonas in order to reclaim land. And it's really beautiful how he's tracing the territory, how the territory is now. So mapping, as you have done, noise, soil, but also plant, in order to use it as a legal tool to reclaim ownership on certain lands that were owned by certain communities that were moved out. As you know, this is an old story for exploitation of the green Amazon, etc. And what he discovered actually is that while architecture was radically removed, so anything that was related with the built form, the houses and all those habitacles that were used by those communities totally disappear. The thing that stayed were the trees. So suddenly some plants resist to this hard exploitation and were able to be alive. And through plants, they could reconstruct the settlements. He could reconstruct, for instance, that some trees were forming a circle. And that circle actually recall how the settlement was defined, because the houses were around a circle. So it would be interesting to see after the fires which plans will emerge again that would recall certain architectures and the history of the territory before the fires.
Thank you. That's really interesting.
Yeah, following what Anna was saying, it reminded me of an Italian scientist called Stefano Mancuso, who is working on, let's say, the resilience of plants and how we can basically, as human beings, learn from plants. And he was saying that compared to the human body, the body of the plant is extremely efficient, because even if you destroy the 90% of a plant, the plant still survives and expands and can basically rebirth. So I think it's an interesting topic to expand in these terms. How plants are stronger than humans and how they can also collaborate. So the idea is that somehow they communicate to each other through the roots. Anyways, this is let's say a comparison with the community of humans. I really appreciated these two projects at the end, and I'm happy that they are at the end, because they really like close this cycle of architecture as a tool to absorb everything that is around. And I think both presentations deal with time and the notion of time and how time can actually be part of architecture. Because waiting and the slowness of architecture probably needs to be there in order for a project to be produced. So I'm very happy to have seen these two projects, both of them. And also I congratulate you for the presentations, because they were following completely different strategies. One was only videos and the other one was only drawings, but extremely effective, both of them. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe this is a good moment to start thinking about wrapping up. I'm thinking both about the exhausted jurors, all our peers in Sydney, which is kind of getting late and probably hungry if they don't having dinner, and also the exhausted student. Thank you everyone for agreeing to participate in the kind of hectic kind of exercise of looking the disparity of studios that we are running right now at UTS, and try to comment on the go really fast in something that kind of had no more context than the fact that we were together to talk about it. I think, we would look at cities and what is urgent and who are we designing for, if there is any chance or hope for collectivity, can we still be local, and what kind of territory are we walking in? And there are questions that have been inside of the studios and inside of the masters this semester and in previous semesters too. And I think what we see today is proof that the discussion is going, even if the conditions are different. Thank you again to all of you and those that have to go earlier, like Tom Weaver and Sumaya that just say goodbye on the chat. We will kind of keep talking, and we will try to organize other events. Any feedback you have of what we've done today, I'll be super happy to hear about. And I'm gonna kind of close the session, and we will have probably private chat with many of you in the coming days. Okay, so thank you. Enjoy. Have a good evening, morning, afternoon, whatever your condition is. Take care.
Thanks for inviting.